Every person who has ever opened a Bible knows the story of Jesus. Born in Bethlehem, worshipped by shepherds, baptized in the Jordan, crucified on a Roman cross, risen on the third day. That is the story the church constructed. That is the version that survived the councils, the burnings, the centuries of institutional enforcement. But there is another story, a complete story. The version preserved in texts the early church fathers tried to destroy not because they were false, but because they were true in a way that made institutional religion impossible. A version of Jesus that does not ask for your obedience, that does not traffic in sin and punishment, that does not position a hierarchy of priests between you and the divine. This is the entire history of the Gnostic Jesus, where he came from, what he actually taught, why the church buried it, and what it means for you right now. Stay with this, all of it, because by the end, the story you were handed will never look the same again. Before you can understand what the Gnostic Jesus was, you have to understand the world he was sent into, not the Roman Empire, not first century Judea, something older and stranger than that. You have to understand the cosmological situation, the actual architecture of reality as the Gnostic texts describe it, because without that foundation, the Gnostic Jesus is just a historical curiosity. With it, he becomes something else entirely. So let's begin where the texts begin. The Gnostic cosmological picture, drawn from sources like the Apocryphon of John, a text discovered in 1945 buried in a sealed jar near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, dated by scholars to approximately 180 CE, but preserving traditions considerably older, starts not with creation but with fullness. The pleroma, a word that translates roughly as completeness, totality, the absence of lack. Not a physical location, not a realm you travel to after death. The pleroma is what existence looked like before anything went wrong. No separation, no scarcity, no decay, no time moving forward and consuming everything in its path. Perfect, self-sustaining, self-aware light consciousness, knowing itself in an eternal act of recognition. The pleroma was populated by what the Gnostic texts call aeons, emanations of the ultimate source which the texts name the monad, the one, the invisible spirit. Not God in the way Christianity uses that word. No personality, no preferences, no throne, no commandments. The monad is better understood as the ground condition of all awareness, radiating outward the way a sun radiates heat, without deciding to, without effort, without diminishment. The Apocryphon of John describes the monad in language that is deliberately paradoxical. It says the monad is, and this is drawn directly from the text, incorruptible, not in perfection, not in blessedness, not in divinity, but superior to all of these. The Gnostic authors were trying to point at something that resists category, something that doesn't fit inside the frameworks human minds naturally reach for. From this source, aeons emerged. Pairs of complementary emanations, each one a facet of the totality, each one expressing a particular quality of the pleroma's nature. These were not separate beings in the way humans are separate. They were more like expressions, like a single note of music that contains within it all the harmonics of the original tone. Now here is where the story breaks open. One of the aeons, the one the texts call Sophia, meaning wisdom acted alone, without her counterpart. Without the consent or knowledge of the pleroma as a whole, she wanted to know the monad directly, independently, to generate understanding on her own terms. And in that act of reaching beyond her own nature, something catastrophic happened. She generated a being, not an emanation of light, not a conscious expression of the pleroma's fullness. Something deficient, something that carried within its very structure the shape of the mistake that made its separation, ignorance, the experience of being cut off from the source. The Gnostic texts give this being a name, the demiurge, and they give him a character, arrogance so complete that upon becoming aware of himself, he looked around at the emptiness below the pleroma and declared himself the only God. This is the being who built the material universe, not as an act of love, not as a gift, as an assertion of sovereignty, as a cage. The cosmos, the demiurge, constructed layer upon layer of planetary spheres, each governed by an archon, each one imposing its own conditioning on every spark of consciousness that passed through, was not the work of a benevolent creator. It was the work of a being who genuinely did not know something greater existed above him. The Gnostic text known as the hypostasis of the archons, also recovered at Nag Hammadi, records the demiurge's declaration. He says, in language the text preserves with extraordinary directness, that he is a jealous God and there is no other. The Gnostic authors read that line and saw in it not a statement of divine authority but a confession of ignorance. A being who actually was the supreme source of existence would have no reason to be jealous. Jealousy requires the perception of rivals. The demiurge perceived rivals because he could sense, at some level, that something existed above him that he could not control. This is the world the Gnostic Jesus was sent into. A cosmos built by an ignorant creator, governed by forces whose primary function was to keep consciousness locked inside matter, cycling through incarnations, forgetting what it was, serving a system that fed on that forgetting. A world where the divine spark, the fragment of Sophia's light, that had become embedded in every human being at the moment of the demiurge's first act of creation, was completely buried under layers of archontic conditioning. That spark needed a messenger. And this is where the Gnostic Jesus enters the story. My name is Marcus, and I have spent years inside these texts, not studying them from a distance, reading them, following the internal logic of each one, trying to understand what the people who wrote them, the people who hid them in jars and buried them in desert cliffs to protect them from destruction, actually believed they were preserving. And the first thing you need to understand about the Gnostic Jesus is the question the Gnostic texts are obsessed with. Not what did he teach, not what miracles did he perform. The question the Gnostic texts return to again and again, in different schools, different traditions, different centuries of composition is this: what was he made of? This sounds like a strange question, possibly even a trivial one, but, for the Gnostic communities, it was the most important theological question that existed, because the answer determined everything else. What his death meant, what his resurrection meant, what salvation meant, what the entire mission was actually for. The Orthodox Christian answer is clear. Jesus was fully human and fully divine. Two natures, one person. He had a real physical body. He was born from a human woman. He bled. He suffered. He died in a body of flesh on a Roman cross. This is the position the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon hammered into doctrinal certainty across the 4th and 5th centuries. The Gnostic answer was fundamentally different. And it was not a single answer. It was a spectrum of positions that clustered around a central conviction, that a being from the pleroma could not and would not take on the full substance of material flesh, because material flesh was not a neutral vessel. It was the product of the demiurge. It was constructed specifically as a prison for consciousness. For a being of pure pleromic light to genuinely inhabit the flesh would mean submitting fully to the demiurge's jurisdiction. And that, for the Gnostic theologians, was cosmologically impossible. The dominant Gnostic position on this question is called docetism, from the Greek word dokein to seem, to appear. The docetic position held that the Christ who walked through Judea appeared to have a physical body but did not actually possess one in the way ordinary human beings do. His body was a phenomenon of light, a projection, a form taken on temporarily to allow communication with the material world. But the substance was not flesh. Now I want to be precise here, because this is often misrepresented. Docetism was not a fringe position held by a few eccentric mystics in a desert somewhere. It was widespread. The letters of Ignatius of Antioch, written around 110 CE decades before many of the canonical Gospels reached their final form, already show him fighting furiously against docetic interpretations of Jesus. Which means docetism was present, influential, and threatening enough to the emerging Orthodox party that one of its earliest major figures felt compelled to attack it repeatedly. The Gospel of Peter, a text not included in the canonical New Testament, but quoted by early church fathers and later rediscovered in an Egyptian excavation in 1886, contains a description of the crucifixion that is distinctly docetic. It records that Jesus, while on the cross, was silent, and then states that he said, quote, my power, why have you forsaken me? And in the next moment, he was taken up. The text describes the cross itself speaking. The body that remained is presented as a husk. The real Christ had already departed. This is the Gnostic understanding of what happened at Golgotha. Not a sacrifice, not an atonement. A theater of liberation playing out inside a prison whose guards could not see past their own limitations. The Apocryphon of John goes further. It describes the Christ figure as coming from the invisible spirit, descending through the archontic layers of the cosmos without being detected, because each archon could only recognize the kind of consciousness it itself had produced. A being of pure pleromic light, wearing only the appearance of flesh, was invisible to the planetary governors. It passed through their checkpoints, without triggering their detection systems. Think about what that means structurally. The Archon's entire function was to keep divine consciousness trapped inside matter, unaware of its own nature. Their power was specifically the power of non-recognition, making sure the divine spark inside each human being never woke up to what it was. A messenger from the Pleroma who carried no material substance was a messenger they literally could not see coming. The second treatise of the Great Seth, also found at Nag Hammadi, takes this even further, and into territory that the Orthodox Church found utterly intolerable. It presents the Christ figure himself, speaking in first person, describing the crucifixion from his own perspective. And what he describes is not suffering, it is observation. He says that it was another who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was another who carried the cross on his shoulders. It was another who wore the crown of thorns, and another upon whose hands and feet the nails were placed. And he, the true Christ, stood at a distance, laughing not at the suffering, but at their ignorance, at the Archon's certainty that they had captured and destroyed something they had never actually touched. This is not cruelty. In the Gnostic cosmological frame, this is the demonstration of something essential. The material world does not have jurisdiction over pleromic consciousness. You cannot crucify light. You cannot kill something that was never fully inside the system that defines death. The implications of this for every human being who contains a divine spark, which, according to the Gnostic texts, is every human being, are enormous. And this is exactly what the Gnostic Jesus came to communicate. Here is something that surprises people when they first encounter it. The Gospel of John, the one that made it into the canonical New Testament, the one that sits in every hotel room drawer in the Western world, is the Gospel most saturated with Gnostic cosmological language, not despite surviving the canonical selection process, possibly because of it. Let me explain what I mean. The Gospel of John begins with what scholars call the prologue. It is 18 verses that precede the narrative of Jesus' earthly ministry. And those 18 verses do not begin with a genealogy, the way Matthew begins, tracing Jesus back to Abraham. They do not begin with an angel visiting Mary, the way Luke begins. They begin with cosmology. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Greek term translated as word is logos. And logos, in the philosophical tradition that the Gospel of John's author was clearly fluent in, particularly in the tradition of Philo of Alexandria, the first-century Jewish philosopher who merged Platonic and Hebrew thought, meant something far more specific than a spoken word. Logos was the principle of cosmic rationality, the mediating intelligence between the supreme, incomprehensible divine source and the material world. The bridge, the emanated expression of the ultimate through which reality was structured. This is pleromic language. This is the language of emanation, not of creation from nothing. The Logos was not created by God, it was with God. It was God in the sense that it was an expression of the same divine substance, not a separate being made by a craftsman. The 4th century bishop Athanasius, who fought ferociously for what became Orthodox Trinitarian doctrine, understood this. The councils that hammered the Nicene Creed into shape understood it. The language of the Johannine prologue was so cosmologically potent, so close to what the Gnostic schools were teaching, that the Orthodox party spent considerable theological effort reinterpreting it to mean something more domesticated, more compatible, with a creator God who made the world out of nothing, rather than an emanating source from which all things flow. Valentinus, the Gnostic teacher who operated in Rome around 140 CE, who had studied under a direct disciple of the Apostle Paul, and who the church father Tertullian admitted was a man of exceptional talent and learning, built his entire theological system in part on a reading of the Johannine prologue. For Valentinus, the opening of John's Gospel was not a doctrinal statement about a historical trinity, it was a cosmological map. The Word was an aeon of the pleroma. The life and the light mentioned in subsequent verses were aeons. The entire prologue was, in Valentinus's reading, a compressed description of the emanation structure of the pleroma itself. Valentinus's school produced some of the most sophisticated theological writing of the 2nd century. His student Ptolemy wrote a letter, the Letter to Flora, preserved in a work by the church father Epiphanius, that is a masterpiece of precise, careful, theological argument. His student Heracleon wrote the first known commentary on any gospel, a commentary on the Gospel of John, in which he unpacked each verse through the Gnostic cosmological lens with a rigor that the later Orthodox commentators had to directly contend with. The point is this: the Gnostic reading of the Gospel of John was not a wild misreading. It was, in many respects, a more textually coherent reading than what the councils later imposed. The councils needed the doctrine of creation from nothing ex nihilo to establish the demiurge as the true and ultimate God, to collapse the Gnostic distinction between the true pleroma source and the ignorant creator of the material world. But the language of John, one does not support creation from nothing. It supports emanation. The Word was not made, the Word was, and then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This verse, John 1:14, is the one the Orthodox party seized on as the definitive refutation of Docetism. The Word became flesh, not appeared to become flesh, became. The Gnostic theologians had answers for this. Valentinus and his school used a distinction between Jesus and the Christ, two different entities that the pleromic messenger temporarily joined together. Jesus was a specially prepared material and psychic body. The Christ was the pleromic aeon that descended at the moment of the baptism in the Jordan River and departed before the crucifixion. The Word became flesh in the sense that pleromic consciousness entered a fleshly vehicle for a specific mission, but the consciousness itself and the flesh were not the same substance. This is not theological hair-splitting. The distinction carries enormous practical weight. Because if the Christ was a pleromic being operating through a temporary material envelope, then what he demonstrated was the relationship between the divine spark and the material body that every pneumatic, every spiritually awakened human being is supposed to realize about themselves. The body is not you. The body is the envelope. The light inside the envelope is what you actually are. The entire Gnostic soteriology, their understanding of how liberation happens, depends on this distinction. And the Gospel of John, even in its canonical form, contains the cosmological architecture that makes that soteriology possible. That is not an accident. It is a trace. A remnant of an earlier tradition that the canonical process could not fully eliminate because the text was already too widely copied and too deeply embedded in the community's life to remove entirely. The Gnostic Jesus is visible in the Gospel of John if you know what you are looking at. And now you do. In December of 1945, a peasant farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near the base of a cliff in Upper Egypt, close to the town of Nag Hammadi, when his mattock struck something hard. He pulled up a sealed earthenware jar, roughly a meter tall. He hesitated to open it. There was a local superstition that jars like this might contain jinn. But hunger for gold overrode superstition. He broke the seal. What fell out was not gold. What fell out was a collection of 13 leather-bound codices books, handwritten in Coptic, containing 52 separate texts. Some of them were previously unknown to the entire modern world. This is where everything changes. Those texts had been buried sometime around the late 4th century, almost certainly by monks from a nearby monastery, who were hiding them from the ecclesiastical authorities carrying out the orders of Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, who in 367 CE issued a formal letter, the Festal Letter, listing exactly which texts were approved for Christian use and ordering all others destroyed. Someone buried the library rather than burn it, and those texts stayed sealed in that Egyptian desert for roughly 1600 years, until a farmer broke open the jar and accidentally handed scholars the most significant discovery in the history of early Christian studies. The library contains texts scholars now recognize as central to the Gnostic traditions: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Truth, the Tripartite, Tractate, the Hypostasis of the Archons, on the origin of the world, the Gospel of the Egyptians, Allogenes, Zostrianos, and dozens more. Not all of them are Gnostic in the technical sense. Some are Hermetic, some Platonic, some are Christian texts that don't fit neatly into any single category. But taken together, they constitute an archive of early religious thought that the institutional church declared war on and very nearly succeeded in erasing entirely. The Gospel of Thomas alone rewrites the conversation about what early Christianity was. It contains no birth narrative, no crucifixion, no resurrection, no apocalyptic judgment, no sacramental theology. What it contains is 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, a list of his words with almost no narrative context, no story around them, just the teaching itself. The text opens with a claim that is either audacious or straightforwardly accurate depending on your framework. These are the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymos Judas Thomas wrote them down. And he said, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these words will not taste death, not whoever believes, not whoever is baptized, not whoever accepts a substitutionary sacrifice or confesses a creed, whoever finds the interpretation. The soteriological engine is comprehension, not belief. The path is gnosis, not faith. Scholars date the saying's tradition in the Gospel of Thomas, the underlying collection of logia before the text was compiled into its current form, to potentially as early as 50 to 60 CE, which would place its source material in roughly the same period as the earliest Pauline letters and before the canonical Gospels were written. This is contested, but it is not fringe. The Gospel of Thomas is treated seriously in mainstream New Testament scholarship as evidence that multiple independent streams of Jesus tradition existed in the first century, and that one of those streams was not primarily concerned with crucifixion theology at all. The Apocryphon of John, meaning the secret book of John, is in many ways the theological center of the Nag Hammadi library. It exists in 4 separate manuscript versions, which tells us it was widely copied and widely read. It presents itself as a post-resurrection revelation given by Christ to the Apostle John while John is grieving after the crucifixion. A luminous figure appears and tells John that the official story, the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, the God of law and wrath and election, is not the ultimate reality. There is something higher, something that has never been named correctly by any institutional tradition. And what follows is a complete cosmological system, a mythology of origin, fall, entrapment, and liberation that reframes the entire biblical narrative from the ground up. The Apocryphon of John is where the Gnostic Jesus most fully articulates what he actually came to reveal. Not sin management, not tribal election, not apocalyptic reward for the obedient. He came to reveal the nature of the real God, the nature of the human being, and the mechanism by which a fragment of divine consciousness can recognize itself and find its way back through the architecture of the prison. This is the text. This is what was buried. This is what the church tried to destroy. And now you're going to understand what it actually says. The Apocryphon of John begins not with a historical claim but with a cosmological correction. Before anything is described, before any figure acts, before any story begins, the text makes a statement about the nature of ultimate reality that cuts against every version of theism the Western world has institutionalized. The true God, the text says, is not a creator, not a judge, not a personality, not a being with preferences or plans, or emotional responses to human behavior. The true God is the invisible spirit, a term that the text immediately qualifies, almost apologetically, by saying that the term itself is insufficient. The invisible spirit is beyond name, beyond description, beyond the capacity of limited consciousness to represent accurately. Any attribute you assign to it is necessarily a reduction. Any name you give it is necessarily a distortion. The text uses the word monad from the Greek, meaning the one, the indivisible unit. But it means something more radical than oneness in the numerical sense. The monad is not one as opposed to two. It is prior to the distinction between one and many. It is the ground condition out of which distinction itself emerges. Before separation, before difference, before the very capacity for anything to be other than anything else, the monad, nothing lacks in it. This is the phrase the text returns to. Nothing lacks in it. No desire, because desire presupposes lack. No movement toward anything, because movement presupposes a destination that is not yet reached. No time, because time is the measure of change, and the monad does not change. It is described as pure light, not the light you see with physical eyes, but a light that has no shadow opposite, a light that does not illuminate anything external, because there is nothing external to it. This is the real God. This is what was before everything else. And the Gnostic Jesus in the Apocryphon of John comes explicitly to announce this. He says, and the text is precise about this, the God that Ialdabaoth announced, the God of the burning bush, and the 10 Commandments, and the jealousy and the wrath, and the tribal election that is not the invisible spirit. That is a subordinate power, a lesser entity, an arrogant creator who fashioned a material world and then declared himself the only God, because, as the text says with remarkable directness, he did not know what was above him. Let that settle. The God of the Hebrew Bible, in the Apocryphon of John, is described as a being who declares, I am a jealous God, specifically because he does not know that there is something above him. The jealousy is evidence of the ignorance. A truly unlimited being is not jealous. Jealousy is the behavior of an entity that fears losing what it has, and a being that fears loss is a finite being, a being that lacks, a being that is not the ultimate ground of reality. This is not atheism. This is not a rejection of the sacred. This is a claim that what the institutional tradition called God is a mistaken identity, that the real source of all being is something so far beyond the demiurge's comprehension that the demiurge did not even know it existed. Now, the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of the invisible spirit's self-expression. Out of the monad's perfect self-awareness comes a series of emanations, paired divine beings called aeons, who exist within the pleroma as expressions of the source's infinite nature. These are not separate gods, they are facets. They are the way perfect fullness articulates itself without ever diminishing itself. Think of a flame that lights other flames without becoming smaller. The source does not lose anything in the act of generating expression. Fullness generates fullness. The aeons exist in a state of perfect mutual knowing, what the texts call syzygy, a pairing, a complementarity. Each aeon is paired with its counterpart, and together they constitute a complete expression of one aspect of the divine nature: wisdom and depth, life and truth, understanding and grace, paired, complete, in perfect relation within the fullness. The Gnostic Jesus Christ, in the Apocryphon of John, is himself an aeon, not a man who became divine through obedience, not a God who temporarily disguised himself as a man, an emanation of the pleroma who takes form within the material world, specifically to deliver the corrective knowledge, the gnosis that the demiurge has suppressed. He is the pleroma reaching into the prison to remind the prisoners of what they actually are. This is the architecture. This is the framework inside which every Gnostic teaching about Jesus makes sense. Remember it, because everything that follows depends on it. Before the material world could exist, something had to go wrong. Not evil in the moral sense, not sin in the conventional sense, something more like a structural rupture, a moment when the perfection of the pleroma developed an instability, and that instability cascaded into the creation of everything you can see and touch and suffer inside of. That something is the fall of Sophia. If you've been following this channel, you may have watched the full video on Gnostic Sophia. That video goes deep into her complete story in a way that this section cannot fully replicate. But the essential structure of her fall is inseparable from the story of the Gnostic Jesus, so we have to trace it here. Sophia is an aeon. She is the last and youngest of the eons within the pleroma, and she is associated in the texts with wisdom, but a particular kind of wisdom, the wisdom that is both the most divine attribute and the most dangerous when it operates without its paired complement. In the Valentinian tradition especially, the pleroma is understood as a self-sustaining system of divine pairs, each aeon paired with its counterpart, each pair in perfect relational balance. The stability of the whole depends on the integrity of each pair. Sophia's paired complement is Christ, or in some versions, theletos, meaning the will. The precise configurations differ across the Gnostic schools, but the essential point is this: Sophia acts alone. She desires to know the invisible spirit directly, without going through the proper relational channels, without the mediation of her complement, without the consent of the pleroma as a whole. She reaches toward the monad with a desire that the monad itself did not initiate, and because the monad is not an object that can be grasped, because it is not a being separate from her that she can reach toward without fracturing her own integrity, she falls, not punishment. Consequence: the physics of the pleroma operating exactly as they operate. What falls from Sophia is not exactly Sophia herself. The texts are careful here. What falls is her desire, her unresolved reaching, her thought that went out without being completed. Some texts call this fallen desire Achamoth, a lower Sophia, a shadow of the divine wisdom operating in the space below the pleroma, a space that now exists precisely because her fall opened it. And in that space, the space below the fullness, the space of lack and incompleteness, something begins to form. Achamoth, the lower Sophia, generates a son. She doesn't intend to. She doesn't choose to in any deliberate sense. She generates from her own unresolved condition, from her ignorance and grief and longing, and what emerges from that state is the demiurge, the craftsman, Ialdabaoth, in the Apocryphon of John, the being who will create the material world. He is real. He is powerful. He has genuine creative capacity. He builds the cosmos. He organizes the elements. He establishes the planetary architecture that structures material existence. But he is built from an incomplete state. He is born of an eon who was herself in a state of lack, cut off from the pleroma, operating in ignorance of the fullness above her. And so he inherits that ignorance. He does not know where he came from. He does not know what is above him. He looks around at the space he occupies and sees nothing above himself, and so he concludes, there is nothing above himself. I am God, he declares. I am a jealous God. There is no other God beside me. In the Gnostic framework, this is not blasphemy against a correct theology. It is the theological error of a limited being who cannot see past his own horizon, and from that error, the material world is built. The demiurge creates with the archons subordinate powers, the planetary rulers, the governors of the various shells of the material cosmos. Together they shape matter, organize the elements, establish the laws that govern the physical world: gravity, time, entropy, biological reproduction, death. The cosmos as the demiurge builds it is not evil in the cartoonish sense. It is ordered. It has structure and pattern and what looks from inside it like beauty, but it is a prison. Not because the demiurge intends cruelty in most Gnostic accounts. The demiurge genuinely believes he is doing the work of the only God, but because the architecture itself, separated from the pleroma, separated from the fullness, is a system of enclosed finitude. Nothing inside the material cosmos, as the demiurge builds it, has access to the infinite. Nothing can grow beyond the limits the archons enforce. Everything runs down, everything ends. This is not a flaw in the design. This is the design. The Gnostic Jesus enters this world as the pleroma's response to this design, not to make the prison more comfortable. To reveal that the prisoner is not actually a prisoner, if the prisoner can remember what it is. Before you can understand what the Gnostic Jesus came to do, you have to understand what the human being is in the Gnostic framework. Because the Gnostic account of human nature is not the one you were handed, not by the church, not by secular materialism, not by the ordinary cultural story about what a person is. The standard account, in the Western tradition, runs something like this. A human being is a body with a soul. The body is physical, temporary, mortal. The soul is spiritual, possibly immortal, either assigned to heaven or hell depending on the criteria of the God who made the assignment. The soul is separate from God, created by God, belonging to God in some sense, but ontologically distinct from God. You are not God. You were made by God, and the universe between those two facts is the entire territory of conventional religion. The Gnostic account is different in a way that is not a minor revision. It is a different claim about what a human being fundamentally is. In the Apocryphon of John, the creation of the human being happens in two stages, and the distinction between those two stages is the key to everything. The demiurge and the archons fashion a material form, a body built from the four elements, modeled on a luminous image that appeared above the surface of the waters. That image, the divine human form, the anthropos, is not something the demiurge invented. It was revealed from above the pleroma's boundary, shown to the demiurge by a power he did not control, an event he did not initiate. The demiurge and the archons look at the luminous image and attempt to reproduce it in matter. They build the biological architecture, the nervous system, the form. But the form they build cannot stand. It lies on the ground. It has shape, but no life. This is crucial to understand. The demiurge can build a body. He cannot generate spirit. He does not have spirit to give, because spirit pneuma, the divine breath, comes from the pleroma, from the invisible spirit itself, and the demiurge has no access to the pleroma. He is separated from it by his own ignorance. So how does the spirit enter the human form? The Apocryphon of John describes what happens next, with a kind of cosmic irony. The demiurge is told by Sophia, or by the invisible spirit operating through a ruse, to breathe into the form he has made. He does. And in the act of breathing, something that was latent in him, something he received from Achamoth, something that came originally from the pleroma through the chain of emanation, a fragment of divine light passes from him into the human body. The demiurge breathes his own spiritual inheritance into the clay, and the clay wakes up, and the human being now contains something the demiurge did not intend to give, something he did not understand he was giving, a spark of the pleroma's own light, embedded in a material form, surrounded by archontic limitations, trapped inside a system of biological necessity and mortality, but present, real, inextinguishable. This is what the Gnostics call the pneuma, the divine spark, the fragment of the invisible spirit that inhabits the human being beneath every layer of conditioning, beneath every archontic program, beneath the biological drives and the cultural scripts and the fear of death that the material world uses to keep consciousness focused on its own survival rather than its own nature. You are not a body that has a soul. You are a fragment of divine light that is currently operating through a body. The body is the vehicle. The body is not you, and the body's mortality is not your mortality. This is the Gnostic anthropology. This is what the tradition says about what a human being actually is. And the reason it matters for understanding the Gnostic Jesus is this. If the human being contains a spark of the pleroma, if there is genuinely divine light embedded in the material form, then what Jesus comes to do is not to inject something into a human being from outside. There is nothing to inject. What he comes to do is to remind, to reawaken, to strip away the layers of archontic conditioning that have convinced the divine spark that it is merely a biological creature in a material world with no origin and no destination beyond the grave. The technical term the Gnostics use for this process is anamnesis, unforgetting, not learning something new, remembering something real that has been systematically obscured. The Gnostic Jesus is not a savior in the conventional sense. He is a reminder. The question is, what does he remind you of, and how does he do it? That is exactly what comes next. He does not lecture. He does not hand down commandments from a mountain. He does not demand belief as the entry price for salvation. The Gnostic Jesus operates through a method that is almost the opposite of what institutional religion has practiced for 2,000 years. The method is question and encounter, not proclamation, not doctrine, not threat. The Gospel of Thomas makes this absolutely clear from its opening lines. This is a text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, and scholars date its earliest layer to somewhere between 50 and 100 CE, which puts it in direct competition with the canonical Gospels for historical proximity to the actual historical figure. And what does this Jesus do in Thomas? He asks things. He provokes. He says things that make no immediate sense, and then leaves the listener to wrestle with them. The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. Not, follow these rules, and you will earn entry into that kingdom. Look, it is already there. Your blindness is the only obstacle. This is a fundamentally different model of religious authority. The canonical Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John speaks with the authority of one who has been sent, who carries divine sanction from above, and who mediates between the human and the divine, through his person, and eventually through his church. The Gnostic Jesus of Thomas, and the Apocryphon of John, and the Gospel of Philip, speaks with the authority of one who recognizes, not mediates, recognizes. He sees the divine spark in the person standing in front of him, and his entire purpose is to make that person see it too. The Gospel of Philip, dated by most scholars to somewhere in the 3rd century CE, and almost certainly of Valentinian origin, describes what this recognition encounter looks like in practice. The text uses the language of the bridal chamber, a term that has been catastrophically misread by later interpreters as something crudely physical. What it actually describes is a moment of interior integration. The pneumatic element, the divine spark inside the person, reunites with its counterpart in the pleroma, not after death, not in some future eschatological event, now, in the encounter with the one who has already remembered. The Gnostic Jesus is, in this framework, the first to have completed what every human being with a divine spark is meant to complete. He is not unique in kind, he is first in degree. This distinction is everything. If he is unique in kind, if he is the only divine human who will ever exist, then the only rational response is worship and obedience. You cannot become what he is, you can only submit to him. But if he is first in degree, if his gnosis represents what every pneumatic human being is capable of, then the encounter with him is not an act of submission, it is an act of recognition. He sees what you are. You begin to see what you are. That is the transaction. The tripartite tractate, one of the longer and more philosophically dense texts in the Nag Hammadi library, frames the mission in cosmological terms. The fall of Sophia, the construction of the material world by the demiurge, the imprisonment of divine sparks in human bodies, all of this, the text argues, was not purely catastrophic. The fall created the conditions for a particular kind of awakening that could not have occurred in the pleroma itself. Consciousness, trapped in matter, cut off from its source, yearning for something it cannot name. That yearning is itself a form of gnosis. The ache is the evidence. The Gnostic Jesus enters precisely into that ache. He does not resolve it from the outside. He names it, and in naming it, he changes its nature from suffering to recognition. This is why the Gnostic tradition consistently emphasizes the interior encounter over the public ritual. Not because rituals are meaningless, the Valentinians in particular developed elaborate sacramental practices, but because the ritual is only the outer form of something that must happen internally to matter at all. You can be baptized 1,000 times. You can receive every sacrament the Church has ever invented. None of it touches the divine spark directly. What touches the divine spark is gnosis, and gnosis cannot be administered. It can only be catalyzed. The Gnostic Jesus is a catalyst. That is his function. And the question the texts then raise with an urgency that crosses 17 centuries without diminishing is what happens once the catalyst has done its work. What does a human being who has received gnosis actually do with it? Where do they go? What changes? This is where the tradition becomes specific. This is where the cosmological framework stops being abstract and starts being uncomfortably personal. Not everyone receives gnosis the same way. Not everyone is capable of receiving it at all. This is the part of Gnostic teaching that modern audiences find most difficult, and it is also the part that has been most consistently either ignored or weaponized by those who encounter it. So let's approach it with the precision it requires. The Valentinian school, the most philosophically sophisticated branch of 2nd century Gnosticism, led originally by Valentinus himself, who taught in Rome around 140 CE, and was, by all accounts, one of the most brilliant theological minds of the ancient world, divided humanity into 3 categories: pneumatics, psychics, hylics. The pneumatic, from the Greek pneuma, meaning spirit or breath, is the human being in whom the divine spark burns at a level that makes gnosis not just possible but inevitable. These are people who will eventually remember, regardless of what obstacles the archons place in their path. The recognition, when it comes, is total. It is not gradual enlightenment built up through discipline and practice. It is more like a switch being thrown. Everything reorganizes around a central recognition that was always present but never visible. The psychic, from psyche, meaning soul, occupies the middle ground. These are people capable of genuine spiritual experience, capable of faith, capable of moral seriousness. But their spiritual life operates primarily through belief rather than direct knowledge. They can receive the outer form of gnosis, the stories, the rituals, the ethical frameworks, and live meaningful lives within those forms. What they cannot access, or at least not easily, is the direct interior recognition that characterizes pneumatic gnosis. The Valentinians, importantly, did not condemn the psychic. They simply recognized a different spiritual register. Most Orthodox Christians, in the Valentinian framework, were psychics, people of genuine faith, genuinely oriented toward the divine, but operating through a system of mediated belief rather than immediate knowing. The hylic, from hyle, meaning matter, is the person in whom the divine spark is either absent or so deeply buried as to be functionally inaccessible in this lifetime. This is the category that makes modern readers uncomfortable, and with good reason. It sounds like a hierarchy. It sounds like some people are simply beyond redemption, written off by the divine before they even begin. The Gnostic texts themselves are not entirely consistent on this point. Different schools drew the line differently, and some texts imply that even hylic consciousness can shift across lifetimes. But the basic framework stands. Not all human beings are in the same spiritual situation, and the mission of the Gnostic Jesus is specifically targeted at those who can receive what he carries. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE specifically to attack and expose the Valentinian school, actually summarizes their teaching on this point with surprising accuracy. He was thorough in his documentation, even as he condemned what he documented. According to Irenaeus, the Valentinians taught that the pneumatic seed cannot be destroyed. It cannot be permanently lost. It will complete its journey back to the pleroma, regardless of how many material lifetimes it requires. This is not universalism in the conventional sense. It does not mean everyone returns. It means that what is genuinely divine cannot ultimately be extinguished. Now, here is the piece that the institutional church found most threatening about this framework. Far more threatening than the cosmological claims about the demiurge. Far more threatening than the alternative creation narratives. If the pneumatic carries gnosis within themselves as an inherent capacity, then they do not need the church to mediate their salvation. They do not need a priest. They do not need a sacrament administered by someone with institutional authority. The divine spark recognizes itself through direct encounter and direct knowing. The entire apparatus of ecclesiastical authority, the hierarchy, the doctrine, the controlled access to sacred texts, becomes not just unnecessary, but actively obstructive. This is why Irenaeus writes with such fury. This is why the early church fathers devoted enormous resources to tracking down, refuting, and ultimately destroying Gnostic communities and their texts. The theological objections were real, but the institutional threat was existential. A Christianity in which the individual pneumatic needs no mediator is a Christianity that has no need for the institution of the church. The Gnostic Jesus, in other words, does not plant a church. He does not establish a hierarchy. He does not appoint successors with institutional authority. He awakens pneumatics. And awakened pneumatics, by definition, require nothing further from any external authority. They have remembered what they are. They know where they come from and where they are going. The archons have no further power over them, not because the archons have been defeated in some external cosmic battle, but because the pneumatic has recognized the archons for what they are: structures of a false world, built by a blind creator, with authority only over those who do not know what they truly are. Every canonical gospel contains a version of the same moment. Jesus finishes speaking to the crowds in parables, dense, symbolic stories that the majority of listeners do not fully understand, and then, privately, he explains the real meaning to his inner circle. The public teaching is one thing, the private teaching is another. This is not a Gnostic invention. This is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The public and the esoteric are already present in the canonical record. But what the canonical record then does is paper over the distinction. It records the private explanations. It makes them public. It turns the esoteric into the exoteric. And in doing so, it raises an obvious question. Were the private explanations we have in the canonical Gospels actually the inner teaching? Or was there a level deeper still, a teaching that the canonical writers either did not receive, did not understand, or deliberately chose not to include? The Gnostic texts answer this question with remarkable consistency. There is a deeper level, and the Gnostic Jesus spent a significant portion of his post-resurrection appearances delivering it. The Pistis Sophia, a text that probably reached its current form in the 3rd or 4th century CE but draws on much older traditions, describes an extended teaching that Jesus delivers to his disciples after his resurrection. Not a brief appearance, not a handful of cryptic sentences before ascending into the sky. A prolonged, detailed, systematic transmission of cosmological knowledge that unfolds over what the text implies is a significant period of time. The resurrected Jesus, in the Pistis Sophia, teaches about the structure of the heavens, the nature of the archontic rulers, the path of the soul through the material world, and the mechanics of liberation. He is doing, in explicit cosmological language, exactly what the Gospel of Thomas does in sayings form, stripping away the illusion of the material world and pointing toward what exists beneath it. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, recovered in fragments, with a significant portion of the text still missing, goes further in a direction that the institutional church found particularly intolerable. In this text, Mary does not merely receive teaching from Jesus. She receives it at a level that the other disciples cannot access. She sees a vision. She receives gnosis through a direct interior encounter that bypasses the ordinary faculties of perception. And when she shares what she has received with the other disciples, Peter rejects it, not because it is factually inaccurate, because it came through her. Because it came through an interior channel that he, with his more exoteric orientation, cannot verify or control. This exchange is one of the most significant moments in all of early Christian literature, Gnostic or otherwise. It encodes the fundamental conflict between two models of spiritual authority. Mary's model, gnosis received through direct interior encounter, validated by its content and its transformative effect, not by the institutional position of the receiver. Peter's model, authority grounded in apostolic succession, in the chain of transmission from teacher to designated disciple, in verifiable external credentials. The church that eventually emerged from the wreckage of the 2nd and 3rd century debates was Peter's church. The Markan model of gnosis was declared heretical, and the texts that supported it were systematically destroyed. The Apocryphon of James, not to be confused with the Apocryphon of John, which is a different and more cosmologically elaborate text, presents yet another version of the post-resurrection teaching. In this text, Jesus explicitly tells his disciples that they have been slow to understand, that the parables he has given them are insufficient, that what he wants to give them is something more direct, more immediate knowledge that does not require interpretation because it bypasses the interpretive faculty entirely and lands in the place of direct knowing. And here is the thread that runs through all of these texts, the single consistent claim that unifies the disparate Gnostic libraries from Nag Hammadi to the Berlin Codex, to the fragments preserved in the writings of the Church Fathers who quoted them in order to refute them. Jesus taught two things. He taught an outer teaching accessible to all the ethical framework, the kingdom parables, the call to love, and an inner teaching accessible only to those capable of receiving it. The inner teaching was not about moral behavior. It was about the nature of consciousness, the structure of reality, the origin and destination of the divine spark. It was gnosis, direct knowledge. Not faith in a proposition, but recognition of a fact. The institutional church preserved the outer teaching, systematized it, and built an empire on it. The inner teaching survived in fragments, buried in jars, hidden in the writings of enemies, passed down in small communities that kept moving as the persecution closed in around them. What was lost, what was deliberately destroyed, was not peripheral. It was not secondary. According to the people who preserved it at risk of their lives, it was the center. It was what Jesus actually came to deliver. And the 1945 discovery at Nag Hammadi means we can now read at least some of it for ourselves. This is where the Gnostic tradition diverges from Orthodox Christianity most sharply and most provocatively. And it is where you need to set aside everything you think you already know about what crucifixion means, what it was supposed to accomplish, and who it happened to. Because the Gnostic answer to all three of those questions is radically different from anything you have been taught. Orthodox Christianity built its entire theological architecture on one interpretation of the crucifixion: substitutionary atonement. The idea that Jesus, as a sinless divine figure, absorbed the punishment that humanity deserved for its sin, satisfied the justice of a wrathful God, and thereby opened a path to salvation that would otherwise have been closed. This interpretation became so dominant that it is now almost impossible for most people raised in Western culture to think about the crucifixion through any other framework. The cross means sacrifice. The sacrifice means debt paid. The debt means grace extended. The Gnostics rejected this framework entirely, not partially, not with modifications, entirely. For most Gnostic schools, the framework of substitutionary atonement was not just theologically wrong, it was cosmologically incoherent. A divine being, a pneumatic being, a being whose true nature belongs to the pleroma and not to the material world, cannot be genuinely killed by the mechanisms of the material world. The archons, who are the actual rulers of the material domain, do not have jurisdiction over what is truly divine. They can affect the material body. They cannot touch the divine spark. This produced a range of Gnostic positions on the crucifixion that Orthodox critics lumped together under the label Docetism, from the Greek dokein, to seem. The docetic position, in its broadest form, is that Jesus only appeared to suffer and die. What the crowd witnessed on Golgotha was the material shell, the borrowed body, the vehicle the divine intelligence had inhabited for the purposes of its mission. The divine intelligence itself could not be crucified, because crucifixion is a material event, and the divine is not material. The second treatise of the Great Seth, the Nag Hammadi text, that is one of the most explicit and extraordinary documents in the entire library, goes further than any other source. It presents Jesus himself speaking in the first person about what happened on the cross. And what he says is staggering. He says that while the crowd thought they were crucifying him, he was standing nearby watching, laughing, not because the crucifixion was meaningless, but because the archons thought they were defeating him, and they were wrong. They were defeating a material body. The divine consciousness they were trying to eliminate was already beyond their reach. This is a direct quote from the text, or as close as the scholarly translation allows. I did not die in reality, but in appearance. It was another, their father, who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was not I. They struck me with the reed. It was another, Simon, who bore the cross on his shoulder. It was another upon whom they placed the crown of thorns. Now, the Church Fathers Irenaeus, Tertullian, Hippolytus treated this passage as evidence of moral bankruptcy. How dare anyone suggest that the suffering of Christ was illusory? How dare anyone deny the reality of the Passion? For them, the physical suffering was the point, the blood was the point, the death was the point. But read the second treatise of the Great Seth from within the Gnostic cosmological framework, and it says something completely different. It is not a denial of suffering. It is a claim about what the archons are capable of controlling and what they are not. The archons built the material world. The archons govern material processes: death, pain, crucifixion. These are material events. What the Gnostic Jesus is saying in this text is that the archons targeted the wrong thing. They thought the body was the being. They thought the vehicle was the driver. They were wrong. And in being wrong, they revealed the limit of their power in the most spectacular way possible. The Apocryphon of Peter, another Nag Hammadi text, describes Peter receiving a vision during the crucifixion in which he sees two Jesuses simultaneously, one being crucified, one standing above the cross, laughing, filled with light. The one above the cross says, "He whom you see being glad and laughing above the cross, that is the living Jesus." The one being crucified is the material substitute, the vehicle, the borrowed form. Why does this matter? Because it completely reframes what salvation means in the Gnostic context. If Jesus was not physically sacrificed to satisfy divine justice, then salvation is not about accepting that sacrifice as payment for your sin. Salvation, liberation, return to the pleroma, is about gnosis. It is about recognizing, as the Gnostic Jesus recognized, that the divine spark cannot be touched by the mechanisms of the material world. The archons cannot kill what you truly are. Death cannot kill what you truly are. The crucifixion is not a transaction. It is a demonstration, a proof enacted in the most dramatic terms the material world could provide, that the divine is beyond the reach of the material. The message of the cross, in Gnostic terms, is not "I died for you." It is, "Look at what they cannot actually do to me. I. Now, look at what they cannot actually do to you." That demonstration, enacted on the cross, is only the surface layer of what the Gnostic Jesus was doing. Because underneath it, running through every encounter, every parable, every confrontation with the authorities of his day, was a body of teaching that the institutional church did not preserve. It preserved the frame, it discarded the content. Here is what the Gnostic texts actually record him saying. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, and dated by scholars to as early as the 1st or 2nd century CE, does not narrate a story. There is no birth account, no passion narrative, no resurrection appearance structured around atonement. What the Gospel of Thomas contains is 114 sayings, logion after logion, and they read nothing like the canonical Gospels. Saying 3, "The kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. Read that carefully. Not, believe in me, and you will enter the kingdom. Not, confess your sins and be saved. Know yourselves." That is the instruction. Self-knowledge gnosis is the mechanism of liberation, not faith in an external event, not adherence to a doctrinal formula. The kingdom is inside you, and you are poor only when you fail to recognize it. This is not the Jesus of the Nicene Creed, saying 77, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." The Christ of the Gnostic Thomas is not a being who descended from heaven to perform a transaction. He is a presence that permeates the structure of reality, embedded in wood, embedded in stone, present not as an external deity to be worshipped from a distance, but as the underlying light of which everything visible is a temporary expression. The Pistis Sophia, a text composed likely in the 3rd century CE, records extended dialogues between the risen Christ and his disciples, including, critically, Mary Magdalene, who speaks more than any other figure in the text, and whom the risen Christ repeatedly identifies as the one who understands most completely, not Peter, not Paul, Mary, the one the canonical tradition systematically marginalized. In those dialogues, the Christ of the Pistis Sophia does not preach atonement. He maps the architecture of the heavens. He describes the nature of the archons, the mechanics of the material trap, the process by which souls descend through the planetary spheres and are clothed in layers of psychic and material substance, and then, crucially, the process by which that layering can be dissolved. Repentance, in the Pistis Sophia, is not moral self-flagellation, it is reorientation, a turning of the inner light back toward its source. The Gospel of Philip, also from Nag Hammadi, makes the language explicit. Those who say that the Lord first died and then rose are wrong. He rose first and then died. If someone does not first attain the resurrection, they will die. And this is not about biological sequence. The resurrection the Gospel of Philip describes is an interior event, an awakening that must happen before physical death, not after it. Grace and resurrection are things you receive now, in this life, or you do not receive them at all. This is the core of the Gnostic Jesus' teaching across these texts. The kingdom is not a future destination, it is a present recognition. The resurrection is not a future event. It is an interior awakening. The light is not a distant God. It is the ground of what you are, temporarily obscured by the layers of material and psychic substance the archons wove around your divine spark. Every canonical reading that moves the liberation event into the future, into heaven, into afterlife, into a kingdom that will arrive when the correct political conditions are met is, in Gnostic terms, a mistranslation. Deliberate or not, the entire apparatus of institutional religion is built on that mistranslation. Delay liberation until after death, and you have a population that obeys now. Locate the kingdom outside the self, in an institution, and you have a population that depends on that institution. This is where the teaching went when the church decided what to keep. The teaching did not die when the institutional church began consolidating power. It went underground, and it flourished in schools, in communities, in the hands of teachers who read the same texts the bishops were beginning to burn, and who built something remarkable from them. The 2nd century CE was the apex of Gnostic creativity. This is not a minor footnote. Between approximately 120 CE and 180 CE, the Gnostic tradition produced thinkers of a sophistication and intellectual range that would not be matched in Western esotericism for centuries. Two names define this period above all others: Basilides of Alexandria, Valentinus of Rome. Basilides was working in Alexandria around 120 to 140 CE. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the ancient Mediterranean world, a city where Egyptian mystery religion, Platonic philosophy, Jewish scripture, and the new Christian movement were all in active, productive collision. Basilides did not avoid this collision. He worked inside it. He constructed what is arguably the most metaphysically sophisticated Gnostic system in the ancient record. His cosmology begins not with a God who creates, but with a non-existent God. This is not a rhetorical paradox. Basilides argued that the highest principle cannot be contained within the category of existence, because existence is a limitation. To say something exists is to say, it is this and not that, here and not there, now and not then. The true source is prior to all such distinctions. It is non-being, in the most radical sense, not nothing, but beyond the category of something versus nothing entirely. From this non-existent God proceeded what Basilides called the cosmic seed, a primordial potentiality that contained within itself every possibility of what would unfold. The 365 heavens of Basilidian cosmology, and he enumerated them, each with its ruling principle, are not separate realms, so much as successive densifications of this primordial seed moving further from its source and acquiring increasing limitation, increasing weight, increasing opacity. The material world is the outermost layer, the most opaque, the furthest from the non-being, that is the source of all. The ruling figure of Basilides' material world is an archon, a creator who does not know what lies above him. This creator is not evil in the cartoon sense. He is ignorant. He mistakes himself for the highest, and that ignorance is the structural condition of the material world that consciousness finds itself born into. Then came Valentinus. Valentinus arrived in Rome around 136 CE. He was educated in Alexandria, almost certainly in contact with the same intellectual currents that shaped Basilides, and he proceeded to do something astonishing. He took the raw material of Gnostic cosmology and constructed from it a complete theological and sacramental system sophisticated enough to function as a genuine alternative to what would become Orthodox Christianity. He did not retreat to the fringes. He nearly became Bishop of Rome. The tradition records that he was passed over for the position by a narrow margin. His system preserved through his students, figures like Ptolemy, Heraclian, and the author of the Gospel of Truth, which may be Valentinus' own composition, begins with the pleroma. The 30 eons arranged in pairs, the syzygies, each pair a complementary duality expressing an aspect of divine fullness, depth and silence, mind and truth, word and life, human and church. The pleroma is not a place. It is a dynamic, relational system, of divine self-expression. What went wrong in the Valentinian account is Sophia's unilateral move, her attempt to know the Father without her partner, without the mediation of the full pleroma. This has been covered in detail in the video on Gnostic Sophia, and if you have not seen that, the full account is there. But the consequence is what matters here. From Sophia's disruption came the material world, the demiurge, and the human condition. Valentinus's solution is correspondingly sophisticated. He divides humanity into three types: pneumatics, who carry the divine spark and are capable of gnosis; psychics, who are oriented toward faith and can be improved through the Church's sacramental life; and hylics, who are entirely material in their orientation and beyond the reach of spiritual awakening in this cycle. This tripartite anthropology is not an elitist judgment, it is a diagnostic map. And within the Valentinian school, the sacramental system, 5 sacraments, including the bridal chamber, a ritual of mystical reunion that dissolved the separation introduced by the fall, provided a practical path toward the recovery of what was lost. These were not fringe figures writing obscure pamphlets. Valentinus and Basilides taught in the most important cities in the Roman Empire. They had students, communities, schools. Their ideas shaped the debate about Christianity's meaning for over 2 centuries. The fact that you have probably never heard a sermon about them is not an accident. The erasure did not happen gradually. It was systematic, deliberate, and pursued with the full institutional and eventually legal power of the Roman state. Understand the timeline. For the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, Christianity was not a single, unified institution. It was a collection of communities, sometimes in contact with each other, sometimes not, reading different texts, holding different theologies, practicing different rituals, and each claiming access to the authentic tradition of Jesus. The Gnostic communities were not a deviation from some pre-existing orthodox core. They were part of the original diversity. The question of which Christianity would survive was genuinely open until the 4th century. That question was settled by power, not by theological merit. When Constantine converted to Christianity in 312 CE and issued the Edict of Milan in 313, giving Christians legal standing across the Roman Empire, he did not convert to Christianity in general. He converted to a specific institutional version that could serve the administrative needs of a centralized empire, a Christianity that had a single creed, a single hierarchy, a single canon, a Christianity that answered the question, who speaks for God, with a single address. The Gnostic traditions, with their emphasis on direct individual access to divine knowledge, their multiple and competing texts, their diversity of cosmological accounts, their insistence that the institutional church was itself potentially an archonic structure, none of this was compatible with imperial administration. An empire cannot be governed by a religion that tells every individual they have direct access to the highest authority. That is not theology. That is a structural impossibility for centralized power. So the consolidation began in earnest. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing his massive work against heresies around 180 CE, is the earliest and most comprehensive of the heresiologists, the heresy hunters whose writings are, ironically, among our primary sources for what the Gnostics actually believed. Since Irenaeus quotes them extensively in the process of attacking them, Irenaeus did not engage the Gnostic texts on their own terms. He catalogued, caricatured, and condemned. His project was not theological refutation in good faith. It was strategic discrediting the construction of the category of heresy itself as a boundary-marking device. Tertullian followed, and then Hippolytus, and then Epiphanius of Salamis, whose Panarion, the medicine chest, attempted to catalogue and refute every heterodox tradition he could identify, approaching 80 distinct groups. Each of these writers did the same work, named the tradition, distorted it sufficiently that it could be dismissed without direct engagement, and associated it with moral corruption. The charge of sexual immorality against Gnostic communities appears in almost every heresiological text. Almost none of it has any support from the Gnostic texts themselves. The Gnostic communities that have left written records are often more ascetic, more morally rigorous than their critics. But the charge was effective rhetorically, which was its purpose. By the end of the 4th century, possession of Gnostic texts in the Roman Empire was not merely a theological error, it was a crime. The Theodosian Code, enacted in 380 CE under Theodosius I effectively made the Nicene Christianity the state religion and classified other forms of Christianity as legal offenses. Libraries were seized. Communities were dissolved. Texts were burned. This is the historical moment that explains the Nag Hammadi library. Sometime around 367 CE, following a letter from Athanasius of Alexandria, the bishop who issued the first list of canonical New Testament books, ordering the destruction of non-canonical texts, someone at or near the monastery at Chenoboskion in Upper Egypt made a decision. They gathered approximately 52 texts. They sealed them in a large ceramic jar, and they buried them in the cliff face near the town of Nag Hammadi. Whoever buried them never came back. For 1600 years, those texts sat in the Egyptian sand. Until 1945, when a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, digging for fertilizer near the cliff base, struck the jar with his mattock. What he pulled out of the ground was not a historical curiosity. It was the silenced half of a conversation that has been running for 2,000 years. The Gnostic communities did not lose the theological argument. They were never allowed to make it in a fair arena. They lost the political and military contest of the 4th century Roman Empire, and everything else was arranged to look like a consequence of that loss. The texts in that jar are not heresies. They are the other half of the story, and for the first time in 16 centuries we have them. There is a figure who appears at the margins of the canonical Gospels and at the absolute center of the Gnostic texts. The difference in her positioning between those two bodies of literature is not a minor editorial variation. It is a theological statement about what the tradition that survived was trying to erase. Mary Magdalene. In the canonical Gospels, she is present at the crucifixion when the male disciples have fled. She is the first witness to the resurrection, and then she is told to go tell the others to be, in the language of later tradition, the apostle to the apostles, and then she disappears. She is given no teaching role, no theological voice, no authority in the community that forms after the resurrection appearances. She witnesses the central event of the tradition and is immediately moved off stage. The Gnostic texts do not move her off stage. They put her at the center. The Gospel of Mary, dated by scholars to the 2nd century CE and preserved only in fragmentary form, we are missing pages 8 through 10 and pages 11 through 14 of the original manuscript, lost, presumably in the same campaign that buried the rest, presents Mary not as a witness, but as a teacher. After the risen Christ has departed, the male disciples are afraid. They are weeping. Peter asks Mary to share what the Christ said to her privately, things the disciples themselves did not receive. She teaches them. She describes the soul's ascent through the layers of the material powers, the archons, the forces that attempt to hold the soul in its material orientation, and the responses by which the ascending soul overcomes each one. She is transmitting cosmological gnosis, active, structured, technical knowledge of the architecture of liberation. And then, Andrew says, he does not believe this teaching came from the Savior, because these ideas are too strange. And Peter asks whether the Savior would really have spoken privately with a woman, spoken with her rather than openly to us. Would he have preferred her to us? Levi rebukes Peter in one of the most striking passages in any ancient text. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. This exchange is not incidental. It is recording a real dispute, a real contest over authority that was happening inside the early communities, and the Gnostic text takes a clear side. Mary's authority is defended against Peter's skepticism, and the grounds of the defense are not seniority or official appointment. They are direct recognition by the Christ himself. The Pistis Sophia makes this even more explicit. Mary speaks in that text more than all the other disciples combined. She asks more sophisticated questions. She demonstrates, in the text's own framing, the deepest understanding. The Christ calls her one whose heart is more directed to the kingdom of heaven than all her brothers. He tells her that she will be superior to all women, and she will be called blessed from generation to generation. The Gospel of Philip contains the passage that has become perhaps the most discussed fragment in all of Gnostic literature. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth. Here the text is damaged and the word mouth is reconstructed, but the framing is clear. The other disciples ask, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" His answer, "Why do I not love you as I love her?" The theological content here is not about romantic attachment. The Gnostic tradition consistently uses the imagery of union, the bridal chamber, the kiss, the companion to describe the condition of those who have achieved interior reunion between the divine spark and its source. Mary, in the Gospel of Philip, is not a romantic interest. She is the exemplary pneumatic. the one who has already achieved what all the others are still working toward. The suppression of Mary from the canonical tradition is the suppression of a theological position, the position that direct gnosis, transmitted through interior experience and recognized by the Christ independently of official hierarchical structures, is the highest authority. That a woman who had received direct transmission was more qualified to teach than men who had received institutional appointment. This was intolerable to what the institutional church was becoming. An institution requires that authority flow through the institution, not around it, not past it, not directly from the divine to the individual, without any institutional mediation. Mary Magdalene's authority, in the Gnostic account, bypasses every structure the bishops were building. That is why she was moved to the margins. That is why her texts were sealed in a jar and buried in the sand for 1600 years. Mary Magdalene's marginalization was not the end of Gnostic Christianity. It was the beginning of a war. And in that war, one figure built the most elaborate, the most philosophically sophisticated, the most structurally complete theological system in the entire ancient world. Not a church father, not an Orthodox bishop, a Gnostic teacher named Valentinus. Valentinus was born in Egypt around 100 CE. He was educated in Alexandria, which in the 2nd century was the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. Alexandria was where Greek philosophy met, Egyptian mysticism met Jewish apocalypticism met early Christian speculation. If you wanted to think seriously about the nature of reality, Alexandria was where you went. And Valentinus went there. He absorbed Platonic cosmology, Pythagorean numerology, Jewish wisdom literature, and the earliest currents of what would become Gnostic theology. Then he took everything he had learned and built something that no one before or since has quite replicated. He moved to Rome around 136 CE. And this is important. He did not go to Rome as a fringe teacher, hiding in someone's basement. He went as a respected theologian who, according to later sources, came very close to being elected Bishop of Rome, very close to leading what would become the Catholic Church. He lost, the sources say, because another candidate was preferred on the basis of having confessed faith under persecution, but the proximity to institutional power tells you something. Valentinus was not marginal. He was central. He was credible. And his theology was, at least initially, considered part of the mainstream conversation. What got him eventually condemned was the content of what he taught. The Valentinian system begins where all serious Gnostic theology begins, with the pleroma, the fullness, the divine realm of light beyond the material world. But Valentinus elaborated the internal structure of the pleroma in extraordinary detail. He described 30 eons paired divine emanations, male and female, arranged in a specific cosmological sequence. These were not symbolic numbers. Each pairing had a name. Each pairing had a function. Each pairing represented a specific quality of divine consciousness that had emanated from the ultimate source and now existed as a distinct but unified aspect of the divine fullness. At the summit of this structure sat the ultimate principle. Valentinus called it the primal father, the forefather, the depth. It was ineffable. It could not be spoken. It could not be comprehended. It could not be named without distortion. And crucially, and this is where Valentinus departs sharply from Orthodox Christianity, this ultimate principle had nothing to do with the God of the Hebrew Bible. The God who made the world, who gave laws to Moses, who commanded armies and demanded sacrifice, was a lower being entirely, powerful but ignorant, creator but not father. The real father was something so far above the world that the world itself was evidence of his distance from it. This is not a minor theological disagreement. This is a complete cosmological revolution. The Orthodox position was that the God of the Old Testament and the Father of Jesus were the same being, one God. One story, one trajectory from Genesis to Revelation. Marcion had already rejected this. We will come to Marcion in detail, but Valentinus built a more intricate alternative. He did not simply say the Old Testament God was evil. He said the Old Testament God was ignorant. There is a difference. Evil implies will, malice, deliberate harm. Ignorance implies limitation, incomplete knowledge, operating from within a constrained perspective. The demiurge in the Valentinian system was not a monster. He was a craftsman who did not understand what he was crafting with, who genuinely believed he was the highest principle in existence, and who created a world that reflected his limitation rather than the divine fullness he had never encountered. The Valentinian school produced texts, substantial texts. The Gospel of Truth, discovered at Nag Hammadi, and widely attributed by scholars to Valentinus himself or to his immediate circle, composed around 150 CE, is one of the most theologically beautiful documents in the entire Nag Hammadi library. It opens not with cosmology but with the experience of gnosis itself. The experience of the Father finding the lost, of the lost recognizing the Father, of that recognition dissolving all the anxiety and confusion that material existence had produced. And this is where Valentinian theology does something that strictly cosmological Gnostic systems do not always do. It connects the abstract metaphysical architecture to the interior life of the person reading it. The aeons, the pleroma, the demiurge, these are not just features of a map of the universe, they are features of a map of consciousness. The drama happening in the divine realm is a drama that plays out inside every human being who carries a spark of divine light in a body made of matter. Valentinus built an architecture. Marcion built a demolition. If Valentinus represents the most philosophically sophisticated current of early Gnostic Christianity, Marcion of Sinope represents the most radically surgical. He did not build an elaborate cosmological system with 30 aeons and paired divine emanations. He asked one question, followed it to its logical conclusion, and the answer he arrived at split early Christianity in a way that forced the Orthodox movement to consolidate, to define, and to canonize in direct response. That question was this: can the God of the Hebrew Bible be the same God that Jesus described as Father? Marcion looked at the evidence with unusual rigor. He read the Hebrew scriptures. He found a God who ordered the slaughter of entire peoples, a God who hardened Pharaoh's heart in order to punish him for the hardness the God himself had installed, a God who demanded animal sacrifice, who played favorites between nations, who expressed jealousy, and who explicitly described himself as jealous, a God who interacted with the world through law, through punishment, through threat, a God of strict justice and retribution. Then Marcion read the teachings attributed to Jesus. He found a God described as Father, a God whose essential nature was unconditional love, a God who did not merely forgive the repentant, but who ran toward the prodigal son before any confession was made, a God who instructed his followers to love their enemies, to forgive without limit, to extend mercy beyond any judicial framework, a God whose kingdom operated on a logic of grace entirely incompatible with the Mosaic law of exact equivalence, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Marcion concluded that these could not be the same being. This was not irresponsible exegesis. This was not ignorance of Scripture. Marcion knew the texts better than most of his contemporaries. His conclusion was that the God of the Hebrew Bible, the Creator, the Lawgiver, the God of justice, was a real but lower divinity, a just God, not evil, but not the highest principle, not Father in the ultimate sense, and that Jesus had come not from this Creator God but from a higher, previously unknown Father, a God of pure love, who had no prior relationship with the material world, who had never made a law, who had never demanded sacrifice, who had no stake in the political history of any nation. Marcion called the Creator God the Demiurge and the higher God, the Father of Jesus, the alien God, alien not in the science fiction sense, but in the Latin sense, alienus, the one who does not belong here, the God who was utterly foreign to the material world, who had no part in making it, and whose love for humanity was therefore a free act of grace, with no prior claim, no prior covenant, no prior obligation. He founded a church, not a small study circle, an actual institutional church, with congregations across the Roman Empire. With its own scriptures, he accepted only the letters of Paul and a version of the Gospel of Luke, stripped of what he believed were later insertions meant to tie Jesus artificially back to Jewish messianic prophecy with its own sacraments, its own leadership structures. The Marcionite Church was not a sect. It was a rival institution, and it was enormously successful. Tertullian, one of the most aggressive Orthodox polemicists of the late 2nd and early 3rd century, wrote an entire 5-volume work against Marcion, a work that survives, and that is one of our primary sources for what Marcion actually taught. Tertullian would not have spent that level of energy against a marginal figure. Marcion was a genuine threat. The Orthodox response to Marcion was, in a specific and measurable way, the origin of the Christian biblical canon. The question of which texts were authoritative, of how the Old and New Testaments related to each other, of what scriptures a Christian community should read. These questions became urgent, precisely because Marcion had forced them. His edited canon provoked the Orthodox to ask, well, what is our canon? And that question, which took centuries to fully answer, began in direct response to Marcion's challenge. He was eventually excommunicated from the Roman Church around 144 CE. He returned the donation he had previously made, a substantial sum, and continued building his alternative institution. The Marcionite Church survived for centuries, with congregations documented as late as the 5th century in parts of Syria. The question Marcion asked has never been answered to everyone's satisfaction. It is still being asked. And the fact that it is still uncomfortable, still unresolved, still capable of destabilizing an entire theological framework that is his legacy. Before Valentinus built his 30-aeon system, before Marcion arrived in Rome with his edited canon and his alien god, before the Nag Hammadi library was assembled and buried and sealed and lost for 16 centuries, there was a tradition that scholars now believe predates all of the named Gnostic schools. Older than the Valentinians, older than the Marcionites, possibly older than Christianity itself, the Sethian tradition. Sethian Gnosticism takes its name from Seth, not the Hebrew villain, not the Egyptian god of chaos, but the third son of Adam, the son born after Cain killed Abel, the one the Genesis narrative treats as a replacement, a continuation, the line through which humanity would carry forward. In the Sethian texts, Seth is something far more specific and far more cosmologically significant than a mere genealogical link. He is the progenitor of a special lineage, a lineage that carries within it a divine seed, a fragment of the true light that the demiurge did not put there and cannot control. The Sethian texts include some of the most ancient and most philosophically dense documents in the entire Nag Hammadi collection. The Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of the Egyptians, not to be confused with the canonical fragment known by that name, but the Nag Hammadi text with that title, which describes the divine genealogy of Seth in extraordinary cosmological detail. Allogenes the Stranger, the three steels of Seth, Zostrianos, Marsanes. These are not popularizing texts written for a broad audience. They are technical theological documents that presuppose a sophisticated reader already familiar with the basic framework. The Sethian cosmological narrative begins, as all Gnostic narratives must, in the divine realm before the material world existed. The ultimate principle, called here the invisible spirit, or the monad, or the one, generates the pleroma through a process of self-contemplation. Barbelo appears as the first emanation, the divine mother, the first thought of the invisible spirit becoming aware of itself. From Barbelo and the invisible spirit, the divine realm fills out in a sequence of further emanations. The Christ figure in the Sethian system is called the autogenes, the self-generated one. He is not the historical Jesus, or not primarily. He is a cosmic principle, a divine aeon, who exists within the pleroma as the principle of divine self-generation and illumination. The historical Jesus, the figure who walks in Galilee, who speaks to disciples, who undergoes crucifixion, is understood by the Sethians as a manifestation or vessel of this cosmic autogenes, not as identical with him. This distinction matters enormously because it means the Christ event in Sethian theology is not primarily a historical event. It is a cosmological event that the historical event merely makes visible for those with eyes to see. The incarnation is not where the story starts. The incarnation is where the cosmic drama intersects with the material plane in a way that human beings trapped in matter can perceive. The Sethian account of creation is detailed and disturbing. The material world was not made by the highest God. It was made by a being who fell into existence without authorization, the familiar Gnostic demiurge, here given names like Yaldabaoth, the son of chaos, the blind god who in his ignorance declares, "I am God and there is no other beside me." The Sethian texts treat this declaration as the defining moment of the demiurge's era. It is not merely arrogant, it is factually wrong, and the wrongness of it, the gap between what the demiurge claims and what is actually true, is what creates the conditions under which human liberation becomes possible. Because if the demiurge is wrong about being the only God, then the demiurge is also wrong about his authority over human beings. His laws are not absolute, his judgments are not final, his world is not the totality of reality. And the divine spark inside the human being, the fragment of true light that came from the pleroma and was trapped in matter without the demiurge understanding what he had enclosed, that spark is not subject to his jurisdiction. The Sethian tradition also preserves some of the earliest and most detailed accounts of Gnostic ritual practice. Baptism appears in the Sethian texts not as a one-time cleansing rite, but as a repeated, contemplative practice, a five-fold baptism in some accounts, intended to progressively loosen the soul from its material entanglement and align it with the divine light of the pleroma. The names of the powers invoked in these baptisms are preserved in the texts: Mikaeos, Micher, Mnesinus, and others, a technical liturgical vocabulary that suggests actual ritual communities performing actual ritual practices, not merely philosophical speculation being dressed in religious language. This is not abstract cosmology. This was a living tradition, practiced by real communities, with real sacraments, real teachers, real transmission. There is a question that scholars have debated for well over a century, and that anyone who studies Gnosticism seriously eventually has to engage. Where did Gnosticism come from? The major Gnostic schools we have examined, Valentinian, Sethian, Marcionite, all emerged in the 2nd century CE in contexts that were self-consciously Christian. They claimed to be presenting the deeper, the more complete, the genuinely transmitted version of what Jesus had taught. But the ideas themselves, the pleroma, the demiurge, the divine spark trapped in matter, the soul's ascent through planetary archons, the distinction between the creator God and the highest principle, these ideas did not begin with Jesus. They have roots that run deeper, older, and wider. One of those roots is Hermetism. The Hermetic tradition preserved in texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest Hermes, a legendary synthesis of the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth, represents a current of ancient Egyptian philosophical and mystical thought that was being written down and systematized at roughly the same time that early Christianity and early Gnosticism were forming. The Corpus Hermeticum, the main collection of Hermetic texts, was composed primarily in Egypt between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, overlapping precisely with the period of early Gnostic development. The parallels are not superficial. The Hermetic texts describe a supreme, ineffable, unknowable divine principle. They describe a process by which human souls descend through the planetary spheres, acquiring the qualities of each planet as material additions to their essential nature, and must ascend back through those same spheres, shedding what was acquired in order to return to their divine source. They describe gnosis direct, experiential knowledge of the divine, as the highest human possibility, something that cannot be transmitted through doctrine or ceremony, but only realized through an interior illumination that transforms the one who receives it. If you remove the names and the specifically Christian narrative elements from a Hermetic text and from a Sethian Gnostic text, a careful reader would have difficulty determining which was which. The underlying cosmological and soteriological architecture is nearly identical. This is not coincidence. Alexandria, the city where Valentinus was educated, where many of the Nag Hammadi texts show signs of composition, where the Hermetic texts were certainly being produced, was the intersection point. It was a city where Egyptian temple wisdom, Greek philosophical schools, Jewish mystical speculation, and emerging Christian theology were all operating simultaneously, cross-pollinating constantly, producing syntheses that drew from all of these streams without being wholly reducible to any one of them. The Hermetic concept of the nous divine mind, the highest faculty in the human being, the part of human consciousness that is genuinely divine rather than merely created, maps directly onto the Gnostic concept of the divine spark, the pneuma, the fragment of pleromatic light embedded in human beings. In both traditions, this is what the soul must awaken to, remember, and identify with. In both traditions, the material world is a realm of illusion, distraction, and forgetfulness. In both traditions, the goal of human existence is not moral improvement within the material framework, not accumulation of merit, not obedience to divine law. It is recognition of what you are at the deepest level, beneath the accumulation of material experience. The Hermetic influence on Gnosticism is also visible in the shared concept of the planetary archons. In Hermetic cosmology, each of the 7 classical planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, rules over a sphere through which souls must pass on their descent into matter and their ascent back out of it. Each planet is associated with a specific quality of consciousness, a specific limitation, a specific distortion. The soul picks these up on the way down and must recognize and release them on the way up. In Sethian Gnostic cosmology, the 7 archons, the planetary rulers created by the demiurge, perform exactly this function. They are the keepers of the material prison. Each one corresponds to a planet. Each one represents a specific form of bondage. And the ascending soul must navigate past each one, must know the passwords and the seals, must possess the gnosis that these archons cannot recognize or intercept in order to return to the pleroma. The Egyptian wisdom tradition was not a footnote to Gnosticism. It was one of its foundations. The scribes who copied the Nag Hammadi texts were almost certainly monks at the nearby Pachomian monastery. But the ideas they preserved were older than Christianity, older than the monastery, older than the desert fathers who built their cells in the same sand where the jar of texts would be buried. Those ideas came from the temples and the philosophical schools of Alexandria. They came from Thoth, from Hermes, from the long tradition of Egyptian reflection on the nature of consciousness, the structure of the cosmos, and the path of the soul through both. Egypt was not the only ancient world feeding into what would eventually become Gnostic thought. There was another current running parallel to it, older in some respects, harder in its edges, more militarized in its cosmological imagination. It came from Persia, and it gave Gnosticism something Egypt had only partially provided, a fully articulated dualism, a war between cosmic forces, so absolute and so total that the material world could not be understood as anything other than a battlefield. Zoroaster, the Persian prophet whose dates scholars debate endlessly, placing him anywhere from 1500 BCE to 600 BCE, depending on the methodology, taught something that no Egyptian theological system had quite managed to formulate with such clarity. He taught that the cosmos was divided, at its foundation, into two irreducible principles: Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the principle of light, truth, and creation that tends toward life, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the principle of darkness, deceit, and annihilation that tends toward death. These were not aspects of a single divine mind. They were not temporary oppositions that would eventually resolve into unity. They were genuinely opposed, genuinely in conflict, and the material world was the arena where that conflict played out in every moment of every human life. This is not metaphor. This is not spiritual poetry. Zoroaster meant it cosmologically. The world you walk through is not neutral. Every object, every choice, every thought participates in one of two currents. Either it serves Ahura Mazda, or it serves Angra Mainyu. Either it moves toward truth, or it moves toward the lie, what Zoroastrians called the Druj, the foundational principle of deception that underlies all material confusion. When you encounter Gnostic texts that describe the material cosmos as the product of a fundamentally deceptive force, when you read in the Apocryphon of John that the demiurge declared himself the only God, and that this declaration was itself a lie, you are reading the legacy of Zoroastrian dualism filtered through centuries of Greek philosophical refinement. The demiurge is not exactly Angra Mainyu, but the structural logic is the same. There is a higher truth, and there is a lower power that conceals it. The lower power is not simply inferior, it actively deceives. Its fundamental nature is the lie. The Persian influence on Gnosticism moved through several channels. The most direct was the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people, beginning in 586 BCE, when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem and deported large portions of the Judean population. These exiled Jews lived for generations inside the Persian Empire. They encountered Zoroastrian priests, Zoroastrian cosmological categories, Zoroastrian eschatology, the elaborate Zoroastrian vision of a final cosmic renovation, a last judgment, a resurrection of the dead, a purification of the world by fire. All of these ideas filtered into Jewish apocalyptic literature. And Jewish apocalyptic literature was one of the direct predecessors of Gnostic mythological thinking. The Book of Daniel, written during the 2nd century BCE, reflects Zoroastrian influence in its angelic hierarchy, its cosmic periodization of history, its vision of a divine being whose dominion displaces a corrupt earthly power. The Dead Sea Scrolls, composed by the Essene community at Qumran, are saturated with a dualism of light and darkness, so thorough that scholars have long debated whether the Essenes were directly influenced by Zoroastrian categories or had simply arrived at similar conclusions through their own reading of earlier Jewish traditions. The answer is probably both. What Gnosticism inherited from this Persian stream was not simply the idea of two cosmic principles. It inherited the idea that one of those principles specifically operates through deception. The demiurge is not merely ignorant, he is a liar. He told the material world that he was the only God. He told the trapped divine sparks that there was nowhere else to go. He constructed a system, the archons, the planetary spheres, the cycles of reincarnation designed specifically to prevent the recognition of what lies beyond him. This is angra mainou translated into Greek philosophical idiom, the lie given a cosmological address and a theological framework. The Zoroastrian tradition also contributed something else that Gnosticism would make central: eschatology with teeth. The idea that this cosmic situation is not permanent, that the conflict has a direction, that the material world is not the final word on reality but a temporary condition that will be overcome. The Zoroastrian renovation of the world, the Frashokerati, the moment when the wise Lord finally defeats the destructive spirit and all souls are restored. This eschatological confidence runs through Gnostic soteriology like a current. The pleroma will be restored, the sparks will return, the demiurge's construction will be dismantled. Not by force of arms, but by the expansion of gnosis, by the spread of knowing through the fragments of divine consciousness still trapped in matter. Before Gnosticism became a movement identifiable by name, before its mythological system solidified into the elaborate cosmological architecture preserved at Nag Hammadi, there was a body of Jewish mystical speculation that was already asking the questions Gnosticism would eventually answer in its own distinctive way. This was the world of Second Temple Jewish mysticism, the body of thought that flourished in the centuries immediately before and after the Common Era, when the temple in Jerusalem still stood, when apocalyptic literature was being produced at a remarkable rate, when Jewish thinkers were wrestling with a question that had become genuinely urgent: if God is transcendent, unlimited, perfect, and wholly other, then what is the relationship between that God and the flawed, suffering, unjust world that human beings actually inhabit? This is the precise question that Gnosticism answered by positing a second, lower creator. But the question itself came from within Judaism. And the Jewish mystical tradition had been approaching the same problem through a different route, through the contemplation of the divine chariot throne described by the prophet Ezekiel in the 6th century BCE. Ezekiel's vision: the four living creatures, the wheels within wheels, the crystalline expanse, the sapphire throne, the figure of human likeness surrounded by fire and radiance, became the seed of what later rabbis called Merkabah mysticism, the mysticism of the divine chariot. By the 1st century CE, there existed a detailed and sophisticated practice of ascending through the heavenly halls, the Hekkalot, approaching closer and closer to the divine throne through meditation, prayer, and the correct use of divine names. The practitioner who successfully made this ascent, and the texts are clear that the ascent was genuinely dangerous, that not everyone who attempted it survived intact, would reach the highest heaven, and behold the kavod, the glory of God, the divine presence that sat enthroned above the cosmic hierarchy. Notice what this already contains: a hierarchy of heavens. Intermediate realms, populated by angelic or semi-divine beings, who can either assist or obstruct the ascending soul. The need for specific knowledge names, passwords, seals to navigate the celestial structure. The idea that the divine is located in a realm utterly beyond ordinary material experience, accessible only to those who have received specific transmission. These are the structural bones of Gnostic soteriology. The Gnostics did not invent the framework from nothing. They radicalized it. They darkened it. They asked, what if those intermediate beings are not simply celestial bureaucrats, but active opponents of the soul's return? What if the architecture of heaven is not neutral infrastructure, but a deliberately constructed trap? The Apocryphon of John, that foundational Gnostic text found sealed in the desert near Nag Hammadi, a text scholars date to the 2nd century CE, but which likely incorporates considerably older traditions, is structured as a revelation discourse. A heavenly figure appears and reveals the true nature of the cosmos to John, the brother of James. The framework is unmistakably Jewish. The concerns are unmistakably Jewish. But the conclusions have been radicalized in a direction that Second Temple Judaism itself could not have tolerated without ceasing to be Judaism. The God of the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh, the one who spoke from the burning bush, the one who parted the Red Sea, the one who gave the Torah on Sinai, is identified in Gnostic texts, not with the highest divine reality, but with the demiurge, with the ignorant creator, with the being who declared himself the only God and whose declaration was a lie. This was the move that made Gnosticism dangerous. Not the cosmological complexity, not the aeons and the archons, not the pleroma, but this specific re-identification of the God of the Torah with a being of limited, deluded, and potentially malicious consciousness. The Gnostic reading of Genesis is devastating in its precision. When Yahweh says, in Genesis 1:26, "Let us make humankind in our image," the Gnostic exegetes ask immediately, who is the us? If there is only one God, who is he speaking to? The Gnostic answer is that Yahweh is speaking to his fellow archons, the subordinate powers who assist in the material creation, and the image they are making humanity in is not the image of the highest divine reality. It is the image of the demiurge himself and his companions. Limited, fearful, mortal, and yet carrying within them, unknown to the archons, a spark of something the archons could not create and cannot destroy. This reading was not arbitrary. It was exegetically serious. It engaged the text of Genesis with genuine attention and produced conclusions that the text, read without institutional constraint, can actually support. The demiurge's ignorance, his boastfulness, his jealousy, "I am a jealous God," all became, in the Gnostic reading, evidence of his limitation rather than his greatness. A truly unlimited being has nothing to be jealous of. Jealousy is the mark of a creature who fears loss, and a being who fears loss is not the unconditioned source of all reality. There is a third river flowing into the formation of Gnostic thought, and it is the one that provided the philosophical vocabulary without which the whole system could not have been articulated with the precision it achieved. This is the Platonic tradition, and its contribution to Gnosticism is so thorough, so embedded in the conceptual architecture of every major Gnostic school, that some scholars of the last century argued that Gnosticism was simply Greek philosophy in mythological dress. That assessment goes too far, but it contains something real. Plato, writing in Athens in the 4th century BCE, produced in his late dialogue the Timaeus, a cosmological account that reads, from a certain angle, like a philosophical first draft of Gnostic mythology. In the Timaeus, the material world is created by a divine craftsman, a demiurge, literally a public worker or craftsman who looks toward an eternal, unchanging model, the world of forms, and attempts to reproduce it in matter. The demiurge of the Timaeus is benevolent. He wants the world to be as good as it can be given the constraints of matter, but matter itself is recalcitrant. It resists the imposition of form. The result is a material world that is a partial, imperfect, degraded copy of the eternal original. This is already a dualism, not as sharp as the Zoroastrian war between cosmic principles, but a dualism nonetheless. The eternal and unchanging the forms, the model against the material and mutable, which is always in process, always becoming, never simply being. The soul, in Plato's account, is not native to the material world. It comes from a higher realm, descends into a body, and spends its earthly life trying to remember through philosophy, through the love of beauty, through the practice of reason the truths it knew before the descent. Anamnesis, unforgetting, the slow recovery of what was known before the body enclosed it. Plato's concept of recollection most famously illustrated in the Meno, where Socrates draws out from an uneducated slave boy a sophisticated geometrical proof, demonstrating that knowledge is not acquired but recovered, gave Gnosticism one of its most fundamental categories. Gnosis is not the learning of new information, it is the remembering of what was always already known. The divine spark does not need to be educated, it needs to be awakened. The difference is total. The Gnostics took Plato's demiurge and did something Plato never did. They made him ignorant. They stripped him of his benevolence. In the Timaeus, the demiurge knows the eternal forms and tries, imperfectly, to copy them. In the Apocryphon of John, the demiurge called Yaldabaoth, named in some texts as Saklas or Samael, does not know the pleroma above him. He does not know the eternal reality he is supposedly modeling his creation on. He creates out of his own limited nature, out of his own distorted consciousness, and the result is not a degraded copy of something beautiful, but a prison constructed by ignorance, mistaken for a world. This darkening of Plato's craftsman figure is the precise move that separates Gnostic thought from Middle Platonism. The Middle Platonists, philosophers like Plutarch of Chaeronea and Apuleius of Medora, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, were Platonists who took the demiurge seriously as a positive creative force, even if they acknowledged the imperfection of the material world. The Gnostics took the same figure and inverted his moral valence. Same structure, opposite evaluation. And this inversion had consequences that extended far beyond philosophy into the practical question of how a person should actually live. If the demiurge is benevolent and the world is his best effort, then living in accordance with the world's order, fulfilling your social role, obeying just laws, Cultivating virtue within the material sphere is a reasonable response to the human situation. This is broadly the ethical conclusion of Middle Platonism. But if the demiurge is ignorant and deceptive, if the world's order is the order of a prison specifically designed to prevent your return to the pleroma, then living in accordance with that order is not virtue. It is compliance with your own captivity. The Platonic tradition also gave Gnosticism its understanding of the soul's structure. Plato distinguished between the rational soul, which belongs to the eternal realm, and the lower appetitive and spirited aspects of the soul, which are more entangled with the body and with material life. The Gnostics translated this into their tripartite anthropology, the pneumatic, psychic, and hylic dimensions of the human person, which we have already examined in detail. The vocabulary is Greek. The metaphysical structure is Greek. But the existential weight, the urgency, the sense that the soul's situation is genuinely desperate, and that gnosis is the only path out, that is something the Gnostics added to Plato from their own experience of living inside a world that felt, to them, like exactly what the mythology described. Plato himself, in the Republic, described the human condition through the allegory of the cave prisoners chained underground, watching shadows on a wall, mistaking those shadows for reality. The philosopher who escapes the cave and sees actual sunlight, and then returns to try to free the others, is blinded temporarily by the light, and is then not believed by those still chained. The Gnostics read this allegory and recognized their own experience in it. They were the ones who had seen outside the cave. The material world was the cave. And the demiurge was, depending on the reading, either the chains themselves or the force that had constructed them. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the three rivers, Egyptian wisdom, Persian dualism, Greek philosophical analysis, had been flowing together for long enough to produce something genuinely new. Not simply a mixture, but a synthesis, a new form of religious philosophical consciousness that was beginning to organize itself around specific teachers, specific communities, specific texts. And the earliest identifiable figures in this developing Gnostic movement came not from Alexandria, not from Athens, not from the Jewish academies of Babylon, but from Syria, from the region that lay between those worlds, and had absorbed currents from all of them. Simon of Samaria, known in early Christian sources as Simon Magus, Simon the Magician, is among the first figures the heresiologists identify as a Gnostic teacher, or at least as a proto-Gnostic one. He appears in the Acts of the Apostles in the canonical New Testament, in the 8th chapter, as a sorcerer who had amazed the people of Samaria with his powers, and who subsequently tried to purchase from the apostles Peter and John the ability to transmit the Holy Spirit through the laying on of hands. Peter rebukes him, he is sent away, and that, in the canonical account, is the end of the story. But the canonical account is not the whole account. The Church Fathers, Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, Justin Martyr, writing several decades earlier, described Simon as the founder of a comprehensive Gnostic system, a teacher who had followers throughout Samaria, and even in Rome, a figure who claimed to be the supreme divine power in human form, who taught a mythology involving the fall and redemption of a divine feminine principle he called thought Enoia, who had descended through successive reincarnations, including a lifetime as the figure of Helen of Troy, before Simon himself found her and liberated her from her captivity. The elements are recognizable: the fallen divine feminine, the redemption through a specific teacher's intervention, the claim of direct contact with the highest divine reality, the cosmological framework in which the material world is a place of imprisonment rather than fulfillment. These are Gnostic categories in embryonic form. Whether Simon himself taught precisely what the heresiologists attributed to him is impossible to verify. The heresiologists had every motivation to exaggerate and distort. But the structural core of what they describe is coherent with what we know from the Nag Hammadi texts discovered 14 centuries after Irenaeus wrote his refutation. Menander of Antioch, described by early sources as a student or successor of Simon, moved the tradition further toward what would become recognizable Gnosticism. He taught in Antioch, the great Syrian city at the junction of Greco-Roman and Eastern cultural currents, a city that was simultaneously one of the earliest centers of the Christian movement and a hub of syncretistic religious experimentation. Menander claimed, according to the heresiologists, that the world had been made by angels, a claim that places the material creation in the hands of intermediate powers rather than the supreme God. He claimed that he himself had been sent from above the angels, from the highest aeon, to reveal the knowledge that would free human consciousness from the angel's control. And he claimed that those who receive baptism from him, his specific ritual baptism, not the apostolic Christian one, would achieve a resurrection that was not physical but cognitive, a transformation of consciousness that transcended biological death. This is Gnosis as a technology, not as a belief system to be accepted on faith, but as a specific transformative process that produces a specific verifiable result. The resurrection Menander promised was not the resurrection of a physical body at the end of time. It was the awakening, in this life, of the pneumatic self, the recognition of what you actually are beneath the layers of material conditioning and archontic deception. This distinction between resurrection as future physical event and resurrection as present cognitive transformation would become one of the sharpest fault lines between emerging Orthodox Christianity and the various Gnostic schools. The Gospel of Philip, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, addresses this distinction directly. It argues that those who say the resurrection will come after death are wrong. Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. If they do not first receive the resurrection while they live, when they die, they will receive nothing. This is Menander's insight, or at least a closely related one, preserved in a later text, developed through several generations of transmission, but carrying the same structural conviction, that the transformation the Gnostics called salvation is not something that happens to a body after death, but something that happens to a consciousness before it. Syria in the 1st century was a crucible. The Silk Road passed through it. Jewish communities, Greek philosophical schools, early Christian communities, Zoroastrian influence from the east, Egyptian religious currents from the south, all of these were present simultaneously in the cities and towns of the Syrian-Palestinian corridor. It was exactly the kind of environment where a new synthesis could emerge, and it did. The figures of Simon and Menander, whatever we can recover of their actual teachings beneath the polemical distortions of their opponents, represent the moment when the currents that had been building for centuries began to crystallize into something that could be called, for the first time, a Gnostic movement. From that crucible, a new generation emerged, not just teachers repeating what they had received, but architects, people who looked at the raw material of Gnostic insight, the cosmological drama, the sleeping spark, the ignorant creator, the alien God above, and decided to build something comprehensive, something that could stand against the increasingly organized weight of proto-Orthodox Christianity. The most important of these architects was a man named Valentinus. Valentinus was not a fringe figure hiding in a desert cave. He was educated in Alexandria, one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world, a city where Platonic philosophy, Jewish scripture, and Egyptian mystical tradition had been synthesizing for 3 centuries before he arrived. He came to Rome around 136 CE, and by most accounts he nearly became Bishop of Rome, the position that would later be called Pope. He lost the election, depending on which source you read, by a narrow margin. The man who came within a vote of leading all of Western Christianity was a Gnostic. Think about what that means for a moment. The institutional church did not emerge from a world where Gnosticism was a distant heretical fringe. It emerged from a world where Gnostic teachers were competitive candidates for leadership of the most important Christian community in the empire. The split between Orthodox and Gnostic Christianity was not a split between insiders and outsiders. It was a split between 2 groups who both believed they were the legitimate heirs of the original teaching. Valentinus lost the election. He continued teaching anyway, and what he built in the decades that followed was the most sophisticated theological system the ancient Gnostic world ever produced. The Valentinian cosmology begins where all Gnostic cosmology begins, with the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of divine completeness, existing before any world was made. But Valentinus mapped this realm with extraordinary precision. He described 30 divine beings called aeons, organized in pairs, each pair representing complementary aspects of divine reality. The outer limit of this structure, the youngest, most distant aeon from the source, was Sophia, wisdom, the one who would fall. The Valentinian account of Sophia's fall is more psychologically sophisticated than any version that came before it. Sophia's desire to know the unknowable Father directly without the mediation of her partner, without the consent of the pleroma, is treated not as rebellion but as passion, a passion that overstepped its proper boundary. And from that passion, a deficiency was produced, an abortion of consciousness, something that came into being before it was supposed to, carrying her emotional turbulence, her grief, her fear, her confusion, her longing encoded into its very structure. That abortion of consciousness became the foundation of the material world. The demiurge, in Valentinian theology, is not simply ignorant. He is constituted from ignorance. He is literally made of the emotional residue of a consciousness that reached beyond its capacity and broke. When he declares, "I am God and there is no other," he is not lying in the conventional sense. He genuinely does not know what he does not know. His blindness is not a choice. It is his nature. And the world he built carries that nature in every stone, every law, every limitation. Valentinus taught this in Rome. He had students. His students had students. The Valentinian school spread across the Mediterranean world with a speed that suggests it was meeting a need the orthodox version of Christianity was not meeting. By the middle of the 2nd century, Valentinian communities existed in Italy, Egypt, Syria, and the eastern provinces. They were not secret societies. They worshipped alongside Orthodox Christians in many communities, which is precisely what drove the Orthodox leadership to fury. The Valentinian practice of what scholars call the bridal chamber sacrament, a ritual of spiritual reunification described in the Gospel of Philip, was treated by Orthodox opponents as scandalous, as sexual, as dangerous. What the texts actually describe is something closer to an interior experience, the reunion of the spiritual self with its divine counterpart, the restoration of the wholeness that Sophia shattered when she reached too far. Not a physical act, an ontological one. Valentinus himself left behind relatively few direct writings that survived. What we have are fragments, quotations preserved ironically by his opponents, who copied them in order to refute them. But his students Ptolemy, Heraclian, Marcus, Theodotus produced extensive works. Heraclian wrote what is believed to be the first systematic commentary on the Gospel of John. Ptolemy wrote a letter to a woman named Flora that is one of the most careful, intellectually honest, theological arguments from the entire ancient world. The Valentinians were not primitive, they were not superstitious. They were among the most philosophically rigorous thinkers of their era. And the Church worked for 2 centuries to make sure you never learned their names. The Valentinian school was not the only major current running through the Gnostic world of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Parallel to it, and in some ways older than it, was a tradition centered not on the figure of Sophia, but on a figure you may not have expected, Seth. Seth is the 3rd son of Adam and Eve in Genesis. He appears briefly in the biblical text, barely meriting more than a mention as the replacement child born after Cain killed Abel. He is easy to overlook. He is supposed to be easy to overlook, because in the Sethian tradition, that obscurity is precisely the point. Seth is the hidden lineage, the bloodline of divine consciousness that was planted in the material world, not as punishment, but as a mission. The Sethians drew on a cluster of texts, many of which were among the most important documents found at Nag Hammadi in 1945. The Apocryphon of John, the secret teaching that John receives after the resurrection, describing the entire cosmological drama from the monad, through the fall of Sophia, through the construction of the material world, through the first human, is a Sethian text. The Gospel of the Egyptians, which describes the celestial Seth as a savior figure who descends repeatedly through history, is a Sethian text. Allogenes, Zostrianos, the 3 steels of Seth, all Sethian. The Sethian cosmological system is among the most elaborate in the ancient world. It describes multiple levels of divine reality above the demiurge, populated by named divine beings, and organized into specific relationships. The highest triad, the invisible spirit, Barbelo, and the divine self-generated one, forms the apex of a system so complex that scholars have spent decades simply mapping it. Barbelo deserves particular attention because she appears almost nowhere in the mainstream religious tradition and yet occupies a central position in Sethian thought. She is the first thought of the invisible spirit, the first emanation, sometimes described as the mother of all living. When the invisible spirit becomes aware of itself, that self-awareness takes form as Barbelo. She is, in the Sethian framework, the moment the absolute first becomes relational, the transition from pure being to the capacity for knowing and being known. The divine self-generated one, the 3rd member of the triad, is identified in the Apocryphon of John as the heavenly Christ, not the historical Jesus, but the divine principle of illumination that would later descend into historical form. This is crucial. For the Sethians, Christ is not primarily a historical figure. Christ is an eternal function, the principle of gnosis itself, the capacity for divine consciousness to recognize itself across the barrier of matter and forgetting. And Seth, in this system, is the earthly expression of that function. The child of Adam who carried the divine seed forward through history, producing a lineage of pneumatic human beings, people whose inner constitution makes them capable of receiving gnosis, of waking up, of remembering what they are underneath the conditioning of the material world. The Sethian texts describe Seth as having descended multiple times across human history in different forms. Once as himself, planting the seed, once in the form of Jesus, revealing the gnosis directly, and at the end of time, he will descend again in a final illumination. This is not reincarnation in the conventional Eastern sense. It is something more specific, the repeated intervention of divine consciousness into material history to prevent the complete extinction of the pneumatic spark. This is why the Demiurge and the Archons attempted, according to these texts, to destroy the Sethian lineage. The flood in Genesis, from the Sethian perspective, was not God's punishment of human wickedness. It was the Demiurge's attempt to eliminate the Sethian bloodline, the holders of the divine spark that threatened his control, and it failed. Seth's children survived. The line continued. There is something remarkable about reading these texts alongside the canonical Genesis narrative. Every story that the Orthodox tradition reads as divine judgment, the flood, the tower, the exile from paradise, the Sethian texts read as the Demiurge's panic, as a reaction to the presence in the material world of something he cannot fully control. The official story and the Sethian story use the same events. They reach completely opposite conclusions about who was doing what to whom and why. The Sethian tradition likely had roots in Jewish apocalyptic and mystical movements that predate Christianity. Some scholars identify connections between Sethian cosmology and early Jewish Merkaba mysticism, and the tradition of ascending through divine chariot throne visions, as well as connections to the apocalyptic literature that produced texts like the Book of Enoch. The Sethians were not inventing a new mythology from nothing. They were reinterpreting a mythology that already existed, reading it against the grain, turning the official narrative inside out, and finding a completely different story encoded in its substructure. There is a third major stream within the broader Gnostic world that is different in character from both the Valentinian and Sethian traditions. It does not produce elaborate cosmological systems. It does not name archons or trace the genealogy of divine eons. It does not spend much time on the demiurge or the mechanics of the fall. It is almost purely practical, almost purely focused on what Jesus actually said and what those sayings do to the person who receives them correctly. This is the Thomas tradition, and its central document is the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, part of the same library as the Apocryphon of John and the other Sethian and Valentinian texts, but it is structurally unlike any of them. It has no narrative. There is no story of Jesus' life, no birth, no death, no resurrection appearance. What the Gospel of Thomas contains is 114 sayings. That is all, sayings attributed to Jesus, introduced by the formula Jesus said, arranged one after another without any connecting tissue, without explanation, without a storyline to hold them together. The opening line of the Gospel of Thomas is one of the most important sentences in the entire Gnostic literature. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymos Judas Thomas recorded. And whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death, not will go to heaven, not will be saved, will not taste death. The promise is ontological and immediate, not posthumous and conditional. The knowledge itself, the correct interpretation of these sayings, is what transforms the person who holds it. This is gnosis, in its most compressed and radical form. Some of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas have parallels in the canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke. Scholars have identified roughly half the sayings as having some version present in the canonical tradition, though often in modified or differently contextualized form. The other half are unique to Thomas. And it is in that unique material that the most distinctively Gnostic dimension of the text becomes visible. Saying 3, if your leaders say to you, "Look, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. The kingdom is inside you, not in a building, not in a creed, not contingent on a mediating institution, a priesthood, a set of rituals performed correctly on a schedule, inside you, right now. The condition for access is self-knowledge, not obedience. This is precisely what the institutional church could not allow to become the dominant understanding of Jesus' teaching. Because if the kingdom is inside you and self-knowledge is the key, then you do not need the church, you do not need the priest, you do not need the bishop deciding what is and is not legitimate. You need only to turn inward with sufficient honesty and sufficient depth, saying 70, if you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have it within you, what you do not have within you will kill you. This is not gentle, it does not offer a consolation. It states that the stakes of self-knowledge are total. What you carry inside you, recognized or unrecognized, is either your liberation or your destruction. The Thomas tradition is centered in eastern Syria, specifically in the city of Edessa, the same city where the Acts of Thomas, another important Gnostic document, was produced. The tradition traces its lineage not to Peter or Paul but to Thomas, described in the Gospel of John as the twin Didymos in Greek, Thomas in Aramaic, both words meaning twin. Some Gnostic interpretations read this literally. Thomas is the twin of Jesus, his spiritual double, the one who understood not the outer form of the teaching but the interior reality it pointed toward. The Thomas tradition represents something important in the broader history of Gnostic thought. It demonstrates that not all Gnosticism required a complex mythological architecture. The essential Gnostic move that the divine is interior, that self-knowledge is the path, that outer religious forms are impediments, rather than vehicles could be made through pure teaching, through sayings alone, without a single archon named or a cosmological level described. Scholars date the Gospel of Thomas, or at least its core sayings collection, to approximately 50 to 100 CE. Some argue that it preserves sayings, traditions that are as early as or earlier than the canonical Gospels. This claim remains contested, but even the conservative dating places it within the 1st century of the Common Era, earlier than most of the elaborate Sethian and Valentinian systematizations. The insight came before the system. The fire was burning before anyone built an architecture around it. By the end of the 2nd century, the situation had shifted decisively. The movement that had produced Valentinus and Ptolemy and Heraclean, that had generated the Sethian corpus and the Thomas tradition, that had built communities across the Mediterranean world. This movement was now facing an organized campaign of elimination, not debate. Elimination. The figures who led this campaign are some of the most consequential names in the history of Christianity, though they are rarely presented to you in the context of what they were actually doing. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, produced a 5-volume work called Against Heresies. Its technical title is The Unmasking and Overthrow of Knowledge Falsely So Called. The last 4 words are a reference to Gnosis knowledge. The institutional church's position was not that Gnosis was wrong in some specific theological claim. The position was that Gnosis itself, the category of direct, transformative, interior knowledge, was false. Think about what that means. The church was not arguing against a particular cosmological error in Valentinian theology. It was arguing against the legitimacy of direct knowing, against the very possibility that a human consciousness could have unmediated access to divine truth. That argument that legitimate access to God requires institutional mediation has been the foundation of organized religion's power structure ever since. Irenaeus did not simply argue against the Gnostics. He systematically misrepresented them. He caricatured their rituals. He took their most subtle psychological and cosmological ideas and reduced them to objects of ridicule. He was effective. For nearly 2,000 years, most of what scholars knew about Gnostic Christianity came from Irenaeus and the other heresiologists, the heresy hunters who followed him: Hippolytus, Tertullian, Epiphanius. These men preserved Gnostic texts in their works specifically to refute them, which is the only reason some of those texts survived at all. But they framed everything they preserved within a narrative of fraud, deception, and moral failure. Tertullian, writing in North Africa around the same period, asked a question that has echoed through Western religious history: what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? He meant it as a rhetorical weapon against exactly the kind of synthesis the Gnostics were attempting: the integration of Greek philosophical insight with the core of the Christian revelation. His answer was, nothing. Philosophy contaminates faith. Reason is the enemy of proper belief. The tradition that followed Tertullian's logic and much of Western Christianity did inherited his suspicion of direct knowing, his preference for authority over insight. In 313 CE, Constantine legalized Christianity across the Roman Empire. In 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea produced the first universal creed, a mandatory statement of belief that every Christian in the empire was expected to affirm. Texts that contradicted the creed were not simply discouraged, they were ordered, destroyed. Bishops across the empire received instructions to deliver to imperial authorities any texts deemed heretical. Possession of Gnostic texts became, in practice, a crime. This is what makes 1945 so extraordinary. The people who buried that library at Nag Hammadi, we do not know exactly who they were. Likely monks from a nearby monastery at Chenoboskion buried it in a sealed ceramic jar to protect it precisely from this campaign. They knew what was being destroyed. They chose to preserve it at personal risk. And then they died, or fled, or simply stopped coming back to retrieve what they had hidden. And the jar sat in the cliff base near the Nile for 16 centuries, waiting. Between the edicts of the 4th century and the texts that survived despite them, you can trace the shape of what was lost. The Valentinian communities did not survive the 5th century in any organized form. The Sethian texts went underground or disappeared entirely in their original contexts. The Thomas tradition in Syria was absorbed, partially, into forms of Christian mysticism that survived precisely by becoming less explicit about what they were doing, stripping the Gnostic content down until it could pass inspection by authorities who would have condemned it if expressed openly. Manichaeism, the great Gnostic synthesis religion founded by Mani in Persia in the 3rd century, survived longer, spreading east along the Silk Road into Central Asia and China, where isolated communities persisted into the 14th century before finally disappearing. Augustine of Hippo, before he became the architect of Orthodox Western theology, was a Manichaean for 9 years. The man whose doctrine of original sin would define Western Christianity's view of human nature was formed inside a Gnostic tradition. He left, he converted, and then he spent the rest of his intellectual life arguing against exactly what he had once believed. The systematic dismantling of Gnostic Christianity was not a quick event. It took 3 centuries of sustained effort, writing, legal action, community dissolution, and in some cases direct violence. What the heresiologists began with words, the imperial church completed with law, and then with force. This is the context in which the Nag Hammadi library was buried. Not an accident, not a random act of preservation. A deliberate decision made by people who understood exactly what was at stake to protect a tradition that the most powerful institution in the Western world had decided must not be allowed to survive. Someone carried those texts into the desert and buried them, knowing they would never come back for them. Think about what that means. This was not a library stored for future retrieval. This was not an archive hidden with the expectation that the danger would pass and someone would return to reclaim it. The people who buried the Nag Hammadi codices in that sealed ceramic jar, in the cliffs above the Nile near the ancient city of Chenoboskion, almost certainly understood they were performing an act of permanent preservation. They were burying knowledge the way you bury someone you love, with the understanding that the world above the ground is no longer safe for what you are protecting. The date most scholars assign to the burial is somewhere around 367 CE. That year is not arbitrary. In 367 CE, Athanasius of Alexandria, the same bishop whose theological positions had shaped the Council of Nicaea 4 decades earlier, issued his famous 39th Festal Letter. In it, he listed for the first time the 27 books that would become the canonical New Testament, and he did something else. He explicitly ordered the destruction of texts he considered illegitimate. He used the word apocryphal not as a neutral descriptor but as a condemnation. Texts outside his list were to be removed from circulation, confiscated from communities, and eliminated. This is the moment. This is the pressure point that almost certainly triggered the burial. The monks of the Pachomian monastery at Nag Hammadi, and most scholars now believe it was members of that community who compiled and buried the codices, were not separatists hiding in the desert. They were literate, organized, connected to the larger Christian intellectual world. They read Athanasius's letter. They understood what it meant, and someone among them made a decision: not compliance, preservation. 13 codices, 52 texts, written in Coptic, the late Egyptian language descended from the ancient tongue of the pharaohs, though most of the originals were composed in Greek centuries earlier. The collection includes what we now call the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Hypostasis of the Archons, the Gospel of Truth, the Trimorphic Protonoia, and dozens of other works that mainstream Christianity had spent generations trying to remove from existence. These were not fringe documents produced by isolated eccentrics. Many of them represent sophisticated theological systems developed over centuries by serious thinkers operating within living communities. The Gospel of Truth, most scholars attribute to Valentinus himself, or to his immediate school. The Apocryphon of John, one of the most complete and internally consistent accounts of Sethian Gnostic cosmology, circulated widely enough that Irenaeus of Lyon was quoting and refuting it as early as 180 CE, meaning it was already established and widespread at that point. These were the texts that the early church had spent enormous institutional energy trying to eliminate, and here they were, all together, in a jar, in the ground. The jar itself matters. Sealed ceramic storage vessels were a known preservation technology in the ancient Egyptian world. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered 2 years after Nag Hammadi in 1947, were similarly stored. The people who made this burial decision knew what they were doing technically. The desert climate of Upper Egypt is extraordinarily stable, low humidity, consistent temperature, no biological activity to accelerate decomposition. A sealed jar in that environment could preserve organic material indefinitely, and it did. 16 centuries passed. The texts survived. What did not survive was the community that buried them. The Pachomian monastic network was gradually absorbed into Orthodox Coptic Christianity. The specific thread of Gnostic transmission that produced the burial appears to have ended there, at that jar, at that moment. No continuation. No secret society passing the knowledge through the medieval period. No underground stream emerging centuries later. Just silence. And then in December 1945, when a local farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer in the cliffs, and his mattock struck a sealed ceramic jar rediscovery. The accident of that discovery is almost impossible to process. Ali al-Saman initially hesitated to open the jar, fearing a jinn. His mother apparently burned some of the loose pages for kindling before the remaining codices were sold, smuggled, separated, and eventually through a convoluted process involving antiquities dealers, competing scholars, the Egyptian government, and Cold War international politics reassembled, translated, and published. The full scholarly edition did not appear until 1977. The texts that the early church had tried to eradicate in 367 CE were finally available to the general public in 1977. That is the distance between the burial and the recovery. That is the gap the tradition crossed. Not through an unbroken lineage of initiates, not through a secret order. Through clay and desert, an accident, and a farmer who almost didn't open the jar. Now we get to what matters most. Not the discovery, not the politics, not the centuries of suppression. The content. What do these texts actually say about Jesus? What portrait of him emerges from the library that was buried specifically to prevent you from reading it? The answer is not a single portrait. It is several, overlapping and sometimes in tension with each other, all of them radically different from the Jesus of the canonical Gospels, and all of them coherent within the larger Gnostic cosmological framework we have been building throughout this entire account. Begin with the most fundamental divergence. In the canonical tradition, Jesus is the Son of the Creator God, the God who made heaven and earth, who spoke to Moses from the burning bush, who handed down the law, who established covenant with Israel that God is the Father of Jesus. The Gospel of John complicates this somewhat with its Logos theology, but the basic architecture remains. Creator and Redeemer are the same God, operating in continuity. In the Gnostic texts, this is precisely reversed. The God who made this world is not the true God. He is the demiurge, the ignorant, arrogant, limited craftsman deity who declared himself the only God specifically because he could not perceive what existed above him. The God of the Old Testament, in most Gnostic systems, is not the Father of Jesus. He is the obstacle Jesus came to circumvent. The Apocryphon of John states this directly. The voice that says, "I am a jealous God" in Exodus, is identified in that text as Yaldabaoth, the Gnostic name for the demiurge, and the jealousy is explained as the jealousy of an inferior being who knows, at some level, that something greater than himself exists. A truly supreme being, the text notes with devastating precision, has nothing to be jealous of. This is not a minor theological adjustment. This is a complete inversion of the entire framework of Western monotheism. The Gospel of Philip, a Valentinian text, reflecting the more mystical and sacramental branch of Gnostic thought, approaches the nature of Jesus differently. Philip's Gospel is not a narrative. It is a collection of meditations. and its treatment of Jesus focuses heavily on the nature of names, on the relationship between the visible and invisible aspects of reality, and on the process of reunion between the divine spark within the human being and its source in the pleroma. Jesus in Philip's Gospel is the one who makes the bridal chamber possible, the reunification of the fragmented divine, feminine, and masculine principles that were separated in the fall of Sophia. The resurrection in Philip is not a bodily event. It is the demonstration that the pneumatic reality is not subject to the material world's constraints. The Gospel of Thomas takes yet another approach. No narrative, no passion, no crucifixion, no resurrection story at all. 114 sayings, attributed to the living Jesus, transmitted through the apostle Didymos, Judas Thomas, who in the Syrian tradition is identified as the twin brother of Jesus. Thomas is itself meaning twin in Aramaic. The central claim of Thomas is stated in its very first line: "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." This is not a gospel of salvation through sacrifice. This is a gospel of liberation through understanding. Many of the Thomas sayings have parallels in the canonical Gospels: the mustard seed, the lost sheep, various parable structures. But Thomas frequently preserves versions that are sharper, stranger, and more cosmologically dense. Saying 77, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This is not the Jesus of sin and redemption. This is the Jesus of omnipresent divine light that permeates all matter, a Jesus whose presence is located not in institutional sacrament or ecclesiastical authority, but in the structure of reality itself. The Pistis Sophia, a longer and more complex text, not found at Nag Hammadi but known from a separate manuscript, presents an extended post-resurrection dialogue between Jesus and his disciples, including Mary Magdalene, who speaks more than any other disciple in that text. In it, Jesus explains the architecture of the cosmic prison in extraordinary detail, the nature of the archons, the structure of the Hymarmone, the astrological fate system through which the archons exercise their control, and the specific practices and invocations through which the soul can navigate the ascent through the planetary spheres after death. These are not the same Jesus. They share a name, some sayings, a historical anchor point in first-century Judea, but the theological function each one serves is radically different. And what unifies all of them, across every Gnostic system, is this: the Jesus of the Gnostic texts does not come to pay a debt to a creator God. He comes to wake you up to the fact that you were never subject to that God in the first place. The official story is that Gnosticism ended. Irenaeus wrote against it. Tertullian wrote against it. Hippolytus wrote against it. Epiphanius catalogued it like a disease. The imperial church declared it illegal. The texts were burned. The communities were dissolved. The bishops were deposed or executed. And by the 5th century, organized Gnostic Christianity within the Roman Empire had been, for all practical purposes, eliminated. That is the official story. Here is what actually happened. The tradition did not end. It transformed. It moved geographically, shifted its outer form, attached itself to new intellectual and spiritual currents, while preserving the core cosmological insight that this world was made by an inferior power, that the human being contains something that does not belong here, and that the purpose of spiritual life is the recognition and liberation of that something. In Persia and Mesopotamia, the Manichaean movement, founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE, became the most geographically extensive religion in the world by the 7th century, stretching from the Roman Empire in the west to Tang dynasty China in the east. Mani explicitly built his system on Gnostic foundations. He had studied Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and the Gnostic Christianity he encountered through communities that traced their lineage back to Thomas and the Eastern missionary tradition. His synthesis preserved the core Gnostic architecture, the imprisoned divine light in matter, the ignorant creator, the messenger of light who comes to awaken the sleeping sparks, the ascent of the soul through cosmic layers back to the true source. The Manichaeans were persecuted with extraordinary ferocity. The Roman Emperor Diocletian ordered them burned alive as early as 297 CE. Augustine of Hippo, before his conversion to Orthodox Christianity, was himself a Manichaean for 9 years, which explains both his intimate familiarity with Gnostic cosmology and the venom with which he attacked it after his conversion. The Manichaean religion was still producing communities in China as late as the 13th century. In the Byzantine world, and later in the medieval Balkans, the Paulician movement, named after Paul, but theologically closer to Marcionite and Gnostic Christianity than to anything, Pauline maintained communities in Armenia and Anatolia from the 7th century onward. They rejected the material world as the creation of an evil power, rejected the cross as a symbol of veneration, rejected the Old Testament as the scripture of a false god, and rejected the priesthood and sacramental system of Orthodox Christianity entirely. The Byzantine Empire deported whole Paulician communities to the Balkans in an attempt to dilute and dissolve the movement. Instead, they seeded a new one. The Bogomils emerged in Bulgaria in the 10th century, directly descended intellectually and probably organizationally from the Paulicians. Their name means beloved of God. Their theology was unmistakably Gnostic in structure. A good God responsible for the spiritual realm, an evil demiurgic power responsible for the material world, the human soul as a divine spark trapped in a body manufactured by that evil power. The Bogomils spread through Serbia, Bosnia, and eventually into northern Italy and southern France. In the 12th and 13th centuries, what the Bogomils seeded in the west became the Cathars. The Cathars, also called Albigensians, after the town of Albi in southern France, were the largest organized Gnostic movement in medieval Europe. At their height, they had an established church structure with bishops, deacons, and an ordained elite called the Perfecti, who had undergone a baptism by spirit called the Consolamentum, a ritual with clear structural parallels to the pneumatic baptism described in Valentinian texts. They were embedded in the political and cultural fabric of Languedoc, supported by local nobility, and sophisticated enough in their theology to have produced their own literature and debate publicly with Catholic clergy. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade against them in 1209. It was the first crusade directed not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against Christians in Europe. The military campaign lasted 20 years and killed hundreds of thousands of people. The Inquisition was founded specifically, in significant part, to identify and eliminate Cathar communities that survived the military destruction. The last known Cathar perfectus, Guillaume Bélibaste, was burned at the stake in 1321. This is the line. From the Valentinians of the 2nd century, to the Scythians, to the Manichaeans, to the Paulicians, to the Bogomils, to the Cathars, a continuous thread, broken and dispersed and forced underground, again and again, but never entirely extinguished. The cosmological core survived every persecution. The essential claim that this world is not the creation of the true God, that you contain something the demiurge cannot reach, that knowledge is the path and not faith in an institution that kept finding new vessels. And then, in 1945, a farmer struck a jar in the Egyptian desert, and the original source material came back. You know that feeling. You have known it your entire life. That persistent, low-level sense that something about this world is fundamentally wrong. Not wrong in a fixable, political, institutional way, though those things are wrong too, wrong in a deeper register. Like the problem is not the particular arrangement of power, but the ground on which all arrangements of power rest. Like the world you woke up into this morning is a diminished version of something. Like there is a source, real, present, entirely accessible, and yet something is continuously, structurally preventing your access to it. Gnostic Christianity spent 4 centuries developing the most precise and intellectually rigorous account of that feeling ever produced. The texts we have been examining throughout this entire history are not mythology in the dismissive sense, not fairy tales dressed in theological clothing. They are detailed, internally consistent, cross-referenced cosmological frameworks built by extraordinarily intelligent people who were attempting to answer the most serious question a human being can ask. What is this place and what am I doing in it? The Jesus who emerges from those texts is not the Jesus of institutional religion. He is not a sacrifice. He is not the fulfillment of a bloodline. He is not an entity whose death settles a cosmic debt owed to a creator whose moral logic no serious thinker has ever been able to fully defend. He is a messenger, a revealer. Someone who enters the architectural logic of the prison and shows the inmates that the walls are not what they appear to be, that the rules enforced by the archons apply only to the material body, that the pneuma, the divine spark inside you, was never subject to the jurisdiction of the demiurge and never will be. This distinction matters more than almost any other distinction in the history of Western religious thought. The institutional version of Jesus requires your submission. The Gnostic Jesus requires your awakening. One is premised on your guilt, The other is premised on your origin. One tells you that something is wrong with you that needs to be fixed by an external authority. The other tells you that something is right with you that has been deliberately obscured. I want to be direct about something. I have spent years studying this material. I came to it from a place of genuine confusion raised inside a religious framework that felt, from very early on, like it was describing something true in a language that had been systematically bent. The standard apologetics never resolved that tension for me. The heresiologists' arguments never convinced me. What convinced me, what broke something open in a way that has not closed since, was reading the Apocryphon of John for the first time and recognizing the cosmological structure. It describes not as a clever allegory, but as an estuary, account of a felt reality. That is not a small thing to say. I am saying it carefully. On this channel, we have covered the Demiurge in full. We have covered Sophia's complete story. We have covered the Watchers. And in the video that this channel's viewers consistently identify as the foundation, this is the last video you'll ever need about Gnosticism. We built the entire cosmological architecture from the ground up. One viewer wrote in the comments on that video, "It took me 2 years studying Gnosticism that you summed up in 2.5 hours." That comment stayed with me, because that is the goal. Not to replace the primary sources, you should read them. The Nag Hammadi texts are available, translated, accessible, but to give you the map before you enter the territory. This video from the pre-Christian Gnostic currents that shaped the environment in which he emerged, to the textual traditions that preserved a radically different account of his teaching, to the communities that were built around that account, to the systematic campaign that tried to eliminate those communities, to the burial at Nag Hammadi, to the medieval survival of the core tradition through the Manichaeans and Bogomils and Cathars, and finally to the 1945 rediscovery that made all of it available again. This is not ancient history. The Gnostic tradition is not a curiosity sealed in the 2nd century CE. It is a living set of questions that every human being who has ever felt the fundamental wrongness of this world has been circling without knowing the name for what they were circling. The name is Gnosis. The path is the recognition of what you already are, underneath the conditioning. The Jesus of the Gnostic texts is not someone who died for you. He is someone who came to show you that you were never the kind of being who needed someone to die for you. That is the distinction. That is the entire history, and now you have it. The tradition survived everything. The most powerful institution in human history threw at it. 16 centuries in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert, it survived. Because what it describes cannot be permanently destroyed. You cannot burn a recognition. You can only delay it. And the delay, as of right now, is over.